She came to save a building. She didn't expect to find her father's name in its walls or a man who had every reason to tear it down and couldn't quite bring himself to stop listening to her. This is the story of Ren Adler and Callum Vane, a preservation architect, a trauma surgeon, a dying building in Savannah, Georgia, and what it held inside its walls for 37 years. Stay with me until the end. And if you've ever fought to keep something the rest of the world had already decided to let go, drop a comment. I want to know what it was. I want to. The building had been empty for 37 years, but it did not feel abandoned. That was the first thing Ren Adler noticed when she stepped through the gap in the chain-link fence at 6:15 on a Wednesday morning before the city had fully decided to be awake. The air inside Hartley Hospital smelled of dust and standing water and something older wood resin. She thought the particular sweetness of heart pine aged past its century, and the quality of the silence was not the silence of a place that had been forgotten. It was the silence of a place that was waiting. She stood in what had been the main corridor and let her eyes adjust. The clerestory windows along the east wall were mostly intact. 3 panes were broken, and the morning light came through those gaps in narrow columns, falling across the original terrazzo floor in patterns that shifted as clouds moved outside. The terrazzo was cracked in 4 places she could see immediately, and probably more she couldn't. The plaster above her had delaminated in long strips, the lath visible beneath like ribs. A chandelier fixture hung bare from the ceiling. The glass gone. The brass frame still sound, still centered, still exactly where whoever had installed it had decided it should go. Ren set her bag down and took out her phone and began to document. She photographed the terrazzo first, then the plaster, then the chandelier, then the window frames, original wood swollen from decades of humidity, but the joints still tight, the craftwork still legible. She moved down the corridor, slowly pressing her palm flat against the wall at intervals. The plaster was cold. Beneath it, the lath was dry. Beneath that, she knew without seeing it, the original brick. Savannah gray brick, the local clay fired soft and laid in 1889 by men whose names were not recorded anywhere. She turned left into what had been the surgical wing and stopped. A man was standing at the far end of the corridor. I was tall, still in scrubs navy blue, the kind of shapeless institutional fabric that meant he'd come from a night shift or hadn't gone home from one. He was looking at the floor, not at her. He had his hands in his pockets, and his posture had the particular quality of someone who had come somewhere not quite knowing why. Ren said, "You're trespassing." He looked up. His eyes were dark and tired and not surprised to see her. "So are you." She held up her phone. "I'm documenting. There's a difference." "I don't think the fence makes that distinction." He looked around the corridor the way she had looked at the terrazzo, slowly taking inventory. "How did you get in?" "Gap in the southeast corner of the chain link. Someone bent it back. Wasn't me." "It was me," he said, 3 years ago. She looked at him. "You've been coming here for 3 years. Off and on." He turned back toward the far window. The light fell across the side of his face. He looked like a man visiting a grave, not grieving exactly, not performing grief, just present in the way people are present at graves, accounting for something. "My grandfather operated in this room." "I know," Ren said. "That's why I'm here." He looked at her, then really looked the kind of assessment she recognized from people who made fast decisions about fast-moving situations. She was used to being assessed. She was 34 years old, and she had spent the last decade walking into buildings that other people had decided were past saving. And she had learned that the first 30 seconds of any encounter in this work established everything that came after. She met his eyes and didn't look away. "You're the preservation architect," he said. "Ren Adler. I'm here on behalf of the Hartley Coalition. I arrived last night. Callum Vane." He didn't move toward her or offer his hand. "I'm the trauma surgeon who's been trying to get this building demolished for 2 years." "I know that too." A pause. Outside, a bird started up somewhere in the live oaks. A long liquid call she didn't recognize. She was a Philadelphia transplant, and the birds here were different. "You should be careful," Callum Vane said, not unkindly. "The floor in the east corridor has soft spots. 3rd section from the nurses' station." "Thank you," Ren said, and went back to documenting. She had driven down from Philadelphia 2 days before taking I-95 south through the flat middle of Virginia and into the Carolinas, the landscape flattening and then greening as she moved south. The air changing as she crossed into Georgia, heavier, warmer, carrying the particular weight of a coastal spring. She had made the drive in a single long day, stopping once for gas and coffee, arriving in Savannah at 9 p.m. to find a city that was lit differently than she expected. She had expected the postcard version, the squares, the Spanish moss, the antebellum facades, all soft lit for tourism. What she found was more complicated and more interesting. The squares were there, 22 of them, each one a different kind of stillness. But Savannah at 9 p.m. was also a working city, restaurants and bars, and the sound of music from a dozen directions, the occasional container ship visible beyond the river bluff, the whole layered thing of a place that had been continuously inhabited since 1733 and hadn't forgotten any of it. She had checked into a bed and breakfast on Jones Street run by a woman named Dottie, who had pressed sweet tea on her at 9:30 at night and told her everything she needed to know about the Hartley situation in 45 minutes, without once seeming to be briefing her. "The hospital board wants the land," Dottie had said in the tone of someone stating a geological fact. "They've wanted it for 15 years. The new trauma center proposal is the most respectable version of that wanting they've come up with yet, but it's the same wanting. And Dr. Vane," Dottie had paused in a way that Wren was already learning meant she was choosing her words carefully rather than thinking of them. "Callum Vane is not a hospital board man. His grandfather was the last physician chief of staff before Hartley closed. His mother grew up in this neighborhood. He lost a patient 3 years ago, a young man from across the river. 22 years old trauma case. They had to divert him to Augusta because they didn't have the capacity, and he didn't make it to Augusta." She had set down her tea glass. "Callum Vane wants that trauma center because people are dying without it. That's different from wanting the land." Wren had thought about that for a long time before she fell asleep. The Hartley Coalition had its offices in a converted carriage house off Abercorn Street, 2 rooms and a shared bathroom. The walls covered in architectural drawings and planning documents and photographs of Hartley at various stages of its life. The original 1889 construction, an expansion in 1924. The renovation in 1963, the 1986 restoration that had been the building's last significant intervention before it was shuttered the following year. Wren had been here for 4 hours when she'd decided she needed to see the building itself, which was why she'd been up before 6 and through the fence before the city woke. Now she sat in the carriage house with Louise Tron, the coalition's director, and went through what she'd found. "The structure is sounder than the exterior suggests," Wren said. "The brick is intact throughout what I could access. Some of the interior wood has moisture damage, but it's localized. The east wing had a roof breach at some point, and there's been water intrusion, but the subfloor is still solid in most of the space. The terrazzo is repairable. The clerestory windows are the biggest loss risk. If we don't stabilize the broken panes before the summer storm season, we'll lose more." Louise was taking notes. She was in her 50s, small and precise, with the particular energy of someone who had been fighting the same fight for so long that the fight had become her resting state. "What's your honest assessment?" Wren looked at her photographs. "It's savable. I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it. The bones are original and they're good. The 1889 construction was done right. These were load-bearing walls built to last, and they've lasted. The question isn't whether the building can be saved. The question is whether we can make the case compelling enough to matter to 4 council members in 6 weeks. We need 4 votes, Louise said. We have 2 certain. Lott we're not sure about. And Hawkins has been publicly supportive of the trauma center proposal. Tell me about Lott." Louise set her pen down. "Warren Lott has been on the city council for 11 years. He's voted for preservation measures 7 times, and against them 3 times, and the 3 times he voted against, there were questions afterward about the relationships involved." She said it carefully. "Nothing proven, but questions." Wren filed that away. "What's the timeline on the trauma center proposal?" "The hospital board submits their final development plan in 8 weeks. The council vote on landmark status, which would block the demolition permit, is in 6. If we don't get the designation in 6 weeks, the trauma center proposal proceeds. And Dr. Vane presents their case to the council. He presents the medical case. The board has its own lobbyists." Louise paused. "He's not a bad man, Wren. I want you to understand that before you meet him formally. He believes what he's arguing." "I met him this morning," Wren said. "In the building." Louise looked up. "He was in Hartley. He said he's been going in for 3 years." Louise was quiet for a moment. "His grandfather died last year, Dr. James Vane. He operated in that building for 22 years before it closed." Wren thought about the way Callum Vane had stood at the end of the corridor looking at the floor. The quality of that stillness. "I know," she said. The city planning session was held in a conference room on the fourth floor of City Hall, and it was nothing like the council vote itself. No public seating, no presentations. Just the parties submitting to the city planner's preliminary review of both the landmark application and the development proposal. Wren had done 47 of these sessions in her career. She knew the rhythms. She knew how to read the room. She arrived 6 minutes early and found Callum Vane already there, standing at the window with a coffee cup and looking out at Johnson Square. I was in different clothes, dark slacks, a gray shirt, a jacket that fit him like it had been made for him and probably had. He looked like a person who had slept, which was not how he had looked at 6:15 in the morning in an empty hospital corridor. He turned when she came in. Ms. Adler, Dr. Vane. He gestured at the chair across the table from where he'd placed his materials. Have you had a chance to look at the impact study? The hospital board's impact study. It's thorough, he said. I'd like to think you'd find it worth engaging with even from an oppositional position. Wren set her bag down and took out her own materials. I'm not in an oppositional position. I'm in an advocacy position. Those aren't the same thing. What's the difference? Opposition is about blocking. Advocacy is about what you're building toward. She sat down. I read your impact study last night. It's thorough. The mortality data is real, and it's serious. I was quiet for a moment as if he hadn't expected that. Then you understand why? I understand what the numbers say. I also know that the medical need and the building question aren't necessarily the same question, and this process exists precisely to evaluate them separately before conflating them. The city planner arrived a woman named Harriet Cho, mid-40s, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had 18 things to get through before lunch. She introduced herself, confirmed the parties, and began moving through the preliminary checklist. Wren had done these sessions 47 times, and she paid attention to all of it, but she was also aware of Callum Vane across the table from her in a way that was distracting, and she didn't particularly want to be distracted. He was thorough. He listened when Harriet spoke without looking at his phone or his notes. When Wren presented her preliminary assessment of the building's structural integrity, he asked 2 questions, precise technical questions about the brick composition and the 1986 restoration methodology, that told her he had done his research. She answered both questions fully. He said thank you and wrote something down. After, in the hallway, while they were both waiting for the elevator, he said, You mentioned the 1986 restoration. What's your source material on that? The Coalition's archive. There are maintenance logs and a partial set of engineering drawings. Partial. The original architectural firm closed in 1991. Some of the documentation was lost. He nodded slowly. My grandfather talked about that restoration. He was still on staff when they did it. He said they found things in the walls. Wren looked at him. What kind of things? He never said exactly. He said the building had more rooms than the floor plan showed. The elevator arrived. He held the door. I thought it was an old man's memory doing what old men's memories do. Wren stepped in. She was thinking about the floor plan she'd studied for 6 hours the night before, the one that showed the East Wing's second floor as a storage corridor, nothing more. When did he tell you that? About 2 months before he died. Callum pressed the lobby button. I didn't think much of it at the time. The elevator descended in silence. In the lobby, they went in different directions without discussing it. She called Eleanor from the car. Eleanor Parrish answered on the 4th ring, which was 2 rings fewer than yesterday, which Wren was learning to read as a sign of energy rather than reluctance. On Eleanor's good days, she picked up immediately. On her bad days, she didn't pick up at all and called back the next morning as if the lapse were unremarkable. How is the building? Eleanor said without preamble. The bones are good. I need stabilization funding for the clerestory windows before summer. I'll call the foundation. You're not supposed to be making calls. I'm dying, Wren, not dead. There's a difference. Eleanor's voice was dry and steady, the voice of a woman who had been making this particular distinction for 6 months and had decided to find it clarifying rather than harrowing. What else? The surgeon said his grandfather mentioned hidden rooms. A pause. James Vane, I knew him slightly. He was a good doctor and a man who paid attention to buildings. Is there anything in the archive about the East Wing second floor that I missed? The floor plan you have is incomplete, Eleanor said. I've known that for years. The original architect's drawings were held by the firm, and when the firm closed, most of them went to the State Historical Society. But there's a set of field notes somewhere, the foreman's notes from the 1889 construction, that I never found. If they still exist, they'd be in the county recorder's office or in private hands. Wren wrote it down. Eleanor, Don't fuss. I'm not fussing. I'm asking how you are. A longer pause. Outside the car window. Savannah moved past the live oaks with their moss, a woman walking a dog, through one of the squares, a cyclist moving carefully over the old brick pavers. I'm comfortable, Eleanor said, which was the answer she gave now when she meant something more specific. The building is worth fighting for. Don't let them tell you it isn't. I know. And don't make it personal. It's easy to make it personal when you're fighting alone. Keep the argument on the merits. I will. And Wren. Her voice shifted, the dry register softening slightly. Eat something. You forget to eat when you're working. After they hung up, Wren sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The square outside was the particular green of a Georgia spring, not the gray-green of Philadelphia parks in April, but something more saturated, almost tropical, the live oaks in full leaf and the azaleas still going pink and coral and white. She had been Eleanor's research assistant for 3 years, then her junior colleague for 4, and then the person Eleanor called when she needed something done right and couldn't do it herself. Eleanor had taught her to read a building the way some people read faces. Not just the surface, but the structure beneath the decisions made by people long dead that were still legible in the material. She had taught her that preservation was not sentiment, it was argument. It was the claim that what had been made by human hands at a particular moment in history for particular reasons carried information that could not be recreated once it was destroyed. Wren had believed that before Eleanor taught her to articulate it. She believed it more clearly now. She started the car and drove back toward Abercorn Street. That night she went back to Hartley. She didn't plan to. She was at her desk at the carriage house going through the county recorder's archive, digitized in part. The rest requiring an in-person visit she'd scheduled for Thursday. When she looked up and found it was 9:45 p.m., and she hadn't eaten dinner, and the building was 6 blocks away. She went because she wanted to see it in the dark. Buildings were different at night. The distractions of the urban context fell away. No traffic, no pedestrians, no other facades competing for attention, and what remained was the building in itself, its scale and its silhouette, and the way it occupied space. Hartley at night was larger than it looked in daylight. The mass of it set back from the street behind the chain link, and the overgrowth had a quality of solidity that the daylight somehow diminished. In the dark, it looked like what it was, a serious building built by people who believed it would last. She slipped through the fence and stood inside the main corridor without turning on her flashlight. The streetlight filtered through the clerestory windows in soft parallelograms. The building made the small sounds old buildings make at night, a tick of cooling metal somewhere in the walls, and she stood still and listened to them. Footsteps then from the far end of the east corridor. She turned on her flashlight. Callum Vane stood at the junction of the two wings, also with a flashlight, looking at her with an expression that was not quite surprise. "Third time today," he said. "I didn't plan this one." "Neither did I." He looked around the corridor. "I was on my way home from the hospital." "The hospital is not in this direction." "I know." He turned back toward the east wing. "I wanted to look at something." She followed because she wanted to see what he was looking at. He stopped at the second section of the east corridor, second floor, in front of the wall that the floor plan showed as the exterior boundary of the storage area. He put his hand flat against the plaster. "My grandfather said there was a room," he said. "He said it was on the east side, second floor, behind a wall that shouldn't have been there." Wren stood beside him and put her own hand on the wall. The plaster was cold. Standard construction. She tapped it, a flat, unresonant sound. She moved 3 feet to the right and tapped again. The sound changed to slight hollowness, the difference between tapping a wall and tapping a door. Callum was watching her. "Something's behind it," she said. I was quiet. Then, "My grandfather said the hospital used it during segregation, that there was a space that wasn't on the official floor plan, a chapel he called it, that the black families were allowed to use because they weren't permitted in the main chapel on the first floor." He paused. He said the state ordered it closed in 1963 as part of the desegregation process on the grounds that it was unpermitted. The hospital walled it up rather than demolish it. He said at the time everyone assumed someone would eventually put it back. Wren was still listening to the wall. "No one did," Callum said. She turned on her flashlight and illuminated the full section 4 feet wide, floor to ceiling, the plaster uniformly undifferentiated, no visible seam. But she had done this long enough to know that a sealed doorframe left traces. She crouched and looked at the baseboard. There, a discontinuity in the original wood, a 3-inch gap where the base had been patched. "There's a door here," she said. "Or there was." Callum crouched beside her. His shoulder was 6 inches from hers. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold corridor. Then you open it. Not tonight. I'd need to identify the lath pattern first. Confirm there's no structural load on this section, and do it properly instead of just breaking the plaster. She stood. Which means a return visit with tools. He stood too. They were close in the narrow corridor, not uncomfortably so, but close enough that she was aware of it. Why does it matter? He said. It wasn't a challenge. He said it with the quality of someone asking because they genuinely wanted to understand. Architecturally, I mean. You know about it now. It's in the oral record. Why does the physical space matter? Ren thought about how to answer that. Because oral records get disputed, she said finally. Physical evidence doesn't. She looked at the wall. If that room is in there, if it's intact, if there's anything original left in it, it's a material witness. It's the building showing us something about what happened here that can't be dismissed as memory or sentiment. She turned back to him. And it changes the landmark argument. A hidden segregation-era chapel sealed in the walls of an 1889 hospital is a different argument than fine architectural craftsmanship. I was quiet for a moment. It's a stronger argument. Yes. Another pause. Outside somewhere a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the broken windows. You knew about this before tonight, he said. Your mentor told you. She told me the floor plan was incomplete. She didn't tell me why. But you suspected. Ren looked at him. I suspected the building had more to say than the floor plan showed. That's generally true of buildings this old. She picked up her bag. I'll come back Thursday with proper tools. You're welcome to be here or not. I'll be here, he said. She went back through the fence and walked the 6 blocks to the bed and breakfast without turning on her phone. Savannah was quiet at 10:30 on a Wednesday. Not empty, but settled into itself. The bars still going, but the streets between them peaceful, the squares empty and lit by their own iron lamps. She thought about what Callum Vane had said. Can you open it? Not, should you open it? Not, why would you open it? Can you? She thought about his grandfather standing in that corridor in 1986, knowing what was behind the wall, deciding not to say. She thought about Eleanor's voice on the phone. The building is worth fighting for. She ate a sandwich from a late-night place on Broughton Street, standing at the counter, and went to bed at midnight and slept deeply for the first time since she'd arrived. The building was waiting. She had 6 weeks. She was going to be enough. The county recorder's office was on Habersham Street, a squat brick building from the 1970s that had no architectural interest whatsoever and was for that reason a relief to walk into. Ren spent 4 hours on Thursday morning with the digitized property records and 2 hours with the physical archive in the back, supervised by a records assistant named Gerald, who was 63 years old and had been doing this job since 1988 and found the whole enterprise of preservation architecture both baffling and vaguely admirable. You're looking for field notes, he said when she explained what she needed. 1889 construction, that's going to be in the physical stack. The physical stack was organized by decade and then by street address, and it was complete in the way that Southern County records offices were sometimes complete not because the county had been especially systematic, but because the building had never flooded, never burned, and the people who worked here had never thrown anything away. Gerald found the correct box in 40 minutes and left her with it at a reading table under fluorescent lights with a pair of cotton gloves. The field notes were in a cloth-bound ledger, 48 pages written in a cramped hand in brown ink that had faded to near illegibility in places. The handwriting belonged to a man named W.T. Arden, who identified himself on the first page as the construction foreman and who had apparently found it necessary to record not just the daily progress of construction, but his opinions of the architectural firm's decisions, the quality of the local brick, the behavior of his crew, and the weather. Ren photographed every page before she read a word of it. Then she read it. W.T. Arden had opinions about everything and did not spare them. He had opinions about the architect Sound Man, Good Eye, won't listen about the East Foundation. He had opinions about the city's decision to site the hospital where they did the square lot is better, but the mayor's cousin owns the corner lot. And there's your answer. He had opinions about the materials. Georgia brick is good brick. North Carolina lime is better lime. They ordered Georgia lime, and they'll spend 20 years wondering why the plaster doesn't set right. On page 31 dated August 14, 89. He wrote, E-wing second floor. The architect has added a room not on the final plan, a small chapel, 14 by 18 with a window cut to the east. He tells me it is for the colored families who will not be permitted in the main chapel, and that the board has approved it privately, though it cannot appear on the official documents as such. I am to document it here and not elsewhere. I have done so. It is a fine room. The window faces the right direction for the morning. Wren sat with that for a while. Then she photographed page 31, 3 times from different angles, put the ledger carefully back in its box, and returned it to Gerald. Find what you needed, he asked. Yes, she said. Thank you. She walked out into the Savannah morning, the heat already building by 10 a.m., the azaleas mostly gone now, but the air still carrying something floral from somewhere, and called Louise. I found the primary documentation, she said, written by the construction foreman in 1889. The chapel was added at the architect's direction with explicit board approval recorded in the field notes because it couldn't appear on the official drawings. She paused on the sidewalk. The room was designed and built as a segregated worship space. It's in the official construction record. It just wasn't supposed to be. Louise was quiet for a long moment. That changes the argument. Yes, we're not making an architectural merit case anymore. We're making a historical significance case, civil rights history documented in primary source material physically present in the structure. She started walking. I need to see what's behind that wall. When? Tonight. I'll know more by morning. She texted Callum at 4 p.m. tonight at 9. Bring a flashlight and don't wear anything you like. He responded 6 minutes later. That's a strange invitation. She wrote back. I found the construction foreman's notes. The room is real. 1889. A longer pause. Then, I'll be there. She ate dinner, a real dinner, rice and beans from a place on MLK Boulevard that had no pretensions and very good food, and went home to change into clothes. She didn't mind getting plaster on and arrived at Hartley at 8:55 with a flashlight, a small pry bar, a stiff bristled brush, and her camera. Callum arrived at 9 on the dot. He was in dark jeans and a worn gray shirt, and he was carrying a better flashlight than hers. Show me, he said. She showed him the photograph of page 31. She watched him read it. He read it twice. 14 by 18, he said. Standard residential room size for the period. It would have had its own entrance at some point, probably sealed in 1963, when the state closed it, which is when the false wall went up. He looked at the photograph for another moment, then handed her phone back. Lead the way. They went up the east staircase. She'd mapped the soft spots earlier in the week and navigated them without thinking and into the second-floor corridor. She'd marked the section of wall with a small piece of blue tape, a 4-foot span at the base, where she'd identified the baseboard discontinuity, and above it, working from the field notes room dimensions, what she estimated to be the sealed door frame. She set down her bag and took out the pry bar. The goal is to find the seam without taking out more plaster than necessary, she said. If the room is intact, I don't want to damage the entry point. What can I do? Hold this. She handed him her flashlight. She worked for 25 minutes, methodically probing the plaster with the pry bar, until she found the give of a seam, then working along it, teasing rather than forcing. Callum held both flashlights steady without comment, moving when she moved, adjusting the angle when she needed different light. He was, she noticed, good at helping without directing. Most people who weren't doing the physical work defaulted to suggestions. He watched, followed her direction without her having to explain everything twice, and stayed quiet. At 9:23, she found the doorframe. It was heart pine like the rest of the building and intact. The 1963 work had plastered over the frame but not removed it, which meant someone had done the job quickly and somewhat carelessly, which was its own kind of preservation. She worked the bar along the frame until she could see it clearly, then found the door itself still hung, still on its original hinges, the hinges blackened but sound. The hinges open outward, she said, to the corridor side, so the seal is on this side of the frame. She found the latch point, a simple bar latch, original, plastered over, and worked it free with the pry bar. Then clicked. She pulled. The door swung open on stiff hinges, moving through a heavy resistance of decades, and a smell came out, old air, dry and still and slightly sweet. The smell of a room that had been sealed before polyurethane and synthetic materials, and had retained only its original components. Wood, plaster, something that might have been candle wax. She stepped in. The room was exactly 14 by 18 feet, which she measured by pacing. The east wall had a window, the original single-pane glass, intact, opaque, with grime but hole set at a height that, in the morning, would catch the first light. The floor was heart pine, the same wood as the corridor, not terrazzo. Whoever had furnished this room had given it a different material than the main building, either deliberately or because the terrazzo work hadn't reached the east wing by the time this room was added. The plaster walls were intact. The ceiling was intact. And on the south wall, still present, still legible, despite decades of dust, a wooden crossplane about 18 inches tall, mounted with 2 cut nails into the original plaster. Callum stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. I didn't speak for a long time. Wren photographed everything: the window, the floor, the walls, the cross, the seal of the door from both sides, the hinges, the latch, the baseboard where the 1963 plaster met the original material. She photographed slowly and thoroughly because what she was looking at was primary evidence, and she intended to treat it that way. When she finished, she stood beside Callum in the doorway. "It's intact," he said. "Yes. The cross has been here since 1889. Brahms, or close to. The mounting hardware is period consistent." She looked at the window. "In the morning, the light comes through there." He looked at the window too. The streetlight filtered through the grime in a faint yellow glow. Not the morning light W.T. Arden had noted, but a suggestion of it. "My grandfather knew about this room," Callum said. "Yes. He came to this hospital for 22 years, and he knew this room was behind this wall." "Yes." I was quiet. "Then he never told anyone?" Wren looked at him. "He told you, 2 months before he died." Callum was still looking at the window. His jaw was tight. She watched him work through something not toward her, not a performance, just a man in a room his grandfather had known about for 40 years, accounting for what that meant. "I wanted someone to find it," Wren said quietly. "He knew I'd been coming here. He knew you'd been coming here, and he told you about the room." Callum turned to look at her. In the low light, his face was very still. "He wanted me to find it," he said. "And he knew that if I found it, I couldn't—" He stopped. "You could still argue for the trauma center," Wren said. "This room being here doesn't settle the medical question. People are still dying." "I know, but it changes what's at stake if the building comes down." "I know that too." He looked around the room one more time. "I need to think." "Take the time you need." She picked up her bag. "I'm submitting the construction foreman's notes to the landmark application tomorrow, along with my photos from tonight. That documentation goes in regardless of anything else." He nodded. They went back down the east staircase together, through the main corridor, out through the gap in the fence. The street was quiet. A cat sat on the opposite sidewalk, watching them with the supreme indifference of a Savannah cat. At the fence, Callum said, "When do you think the morning light hits that window?" Wren calculated. "This time of year, first light around 6:15. The window faces east-northeast, so probably 6:30 before it's direct." He nodded. "All right." She walked back to the bed and breakfast. She wasn't sure what "all right" meant. She suspected he wasn't entirely sure either. She sent the photographs to Louise at 11 p.m. and fell asleep to the sound of the square outside, a faint wind in the live oaks. Something settling in the old house around her. Louise called at 7:30 the next morning, with news that Wren had half anticipated and half not. "The coalition board met last night after I forwarded your photographs. They want to move the chapel to the center of the landmark application. Architectural merit as secondary, civil rights historical significance as primary." Louise's voice was even and quick, the voice of a woman who had been up for a while. "I want your honest assessment of the strength of that argument before I commit to reframing." Wren was on her second coffee, sitting at the small desk in her room with the photographs open on her laptop. "The documentation is solid. Primary source construction foreman's personal ledger, not a hospital record, so it wasn't subject to the administrative purges that removed other Hartley documents in the 60s. The room itself is material corroboration. The cross-the-window orientation, the floor differentiation, everything is consistent with the foreman's notation." She paused. "The weakness is chain of custody on the oral history. We have Callum Vane's account of what his grandfather told him, but James Vane is dead, and there's no other surviving witness we've identified who knew about the room during its active period." "Then we find one?" "It's been 63 years since the room was sealed. If anyone who worshipped there is still living, they'd be in their 80s at minimum." Wren had been thinking about this since she woke up. "It's worth trying. If we can find even one person who has a direct memory of the room, that testimony combined with the documentary evidence is almost unassailable." "I'll put Marcus on it," Louise said, referring to the coalition's researcher. "He's good with oral history." "Good. One other thing." She pulled up the photograph of page 31. "The foreman's notes say the architect added the room with private board approval. I want to find the architect's other correspondence if it exists. Any letter, any memo, any reference to the decision to add an unpermitted room to a public hospital in 1889, that's a story in itself." Where would that be? The State Historical Society, or the architect's family if anyone's traceable. She closed the laptop. I'll follow that thread. She spent the morning on the phone. The Georgia Historical Society, the Savannah chapter of the American Institute of Architects, the library's special collections, and by noon she had 3 promising leads and 1 definitive answer. The architect's name was Herschel Groves. He had died in 1921, and his papers, such as they were, had been donated to the Savannah Area Historical Collection in 1954 by his daughter. The Savannah Area Historical Collection was housed in a building on Whitaker Street that had its own preservation needs, which Wren noticed and filed away without saying anything to anyone, and which had a special collections room with a part-time archivist named Beatrice, who was suspicious of strangers in the way that archivists of rare materials were often and correctly suspicious of strangers. What are you looking for specifically? Beatrice asked. Correspondence from 1888 to 1890 related to the Hartley Hospital Commission. Anything touching on the East Wing construction or the building program. That's a narrow window. I hope so. It was not in the end a narrow window. The Groves papers were extensive, organized by year, and the 1889 folder alone contained 46 items. But Wren was practiced at this, and by 3 p.m. she had found what she was looking for, a letter from Herschel Groves to a man identified only as C.W.H. The initials corresponding she had checked to a hospital board member named Charles W. Hadley, dated June 3, 1889, which read, in part, I have taken the liberty of including in the East Wing program a small room of worship to be positioned on the 2nd floor, its existence to remain unofficial. I believe you will understand the necessity. The families who will use it ask for nothing more than a place to bring their grief and their gratitude, and it costs us little to provide it. The window faces the right direction. I trust this meets with your private approval as we discussed. Wren photographed the letter twice, confirmed its catalog number, and texted Louise. Found the architect's own letter authorizing the chapel, 1889. Named board member. We have the full chain. Louise responded in under a minute, get here. The Hartley Coalition had a board meeting that evening, and Wren presented the complete documentation package to 7 people in the carriage house, while Savannah darkened outside the windows, the foreman's ledger entry, the architect's letter, her photographs of the sealed room, the structural assessment. The board approved the reframed application unanimously, afterwards standing on the sidewalk with Louise. While the others dispersed, Wren said, Have you told Vane? Louise looked at her. Should we? Wren thought about him in the doorway of the chapel room, working through something she hadn't been able to entirely read. He was the one who led me to the room. His grandfather's testimony is part of our oral history record. I think he deserves to know what's in the application before it's filed. She paused. And strategically, he's not our enemy. The hospital board is. If Vane shifts his position even slightly, it changes the council vote calculation. You think he'll shift? I don't know, but he's a thoughtful person. He deserves accurate information. She texted him that night, filing the amended application tomorrow. You should see the full documentation before it's public. Your call, whether to look. He responded at 11 p.m. where and when. She said coalition office, 8 a.m. He arrived at 8 on the dot, as he always arrived. She was beginning to recognize that as a quality of him, the precision, the absence of the performative lateness that some powerful men used as assertion. He sat across the table from her in the carriage house, and she walked him through the full package, the foreman's notes, the architect's letter, the photographs. He went through everything carefully. He read the architect's letter twice, as he had read the photograph of the foreman's notes. He looked at her photographs of the room for a long time. When he'd finished, he set the folder down and looked at the wall. The application goes in today, Wren said. I know. It doesn't change the council vote automatically. The Landmarks Review Board still has to assess it, but the historical significance argument is materially stronger than the architectural merit argument and the civil rights history dimension. I understand what it means, Wren. She was quiet. He had used her first name, and she filed that away without making anything of it. What does this do to your case? She asked. I was still looking at the wall. It complicates it. He said it without bitterness. The hospital board's position is that the building has no significance that outweighs the medical need. This, he gestured at the folder, establishes significance that a lot of people are going to find very difficult to argue against. You could make the argument that the historical significance can be honored without preserving the full building. a commemorative installation, a documented record. I could make that argument. He paused. It would be a weaker argument than the one I've been making. Wren waited. My grandfather knew about this room, Callum said. He worked in that building for 22 years. He watched it fall into disrepair. I was there when it was shuttered. He never said a public word about what was behind that wall. He told you, at the end, when he couldn't do anything about it himself. His jaw was tight again, the same quality she'd noticed in the chapel room. He was a careful man. He made decisions that I respected even when I didn't understand them. I've been trying for a year to understand why he didn't say something publicly, why he didn't tell anyone about the room while he still could. Wren looked at him. What do you think? I think he was afraid it would be used against the trauma center. Callum turned to look at her. I think he knew what the room meant, and he knew that if it became part of the public argument, the medical need would lose. And he thought the medical need should win. But he told you anyway. He told me 2 months before he died when I had been going into that building for 2 years. When he knew... Callum stopped. When he knew I hadn't stopped going back, Wren understood suddenly what that meant. He knew you couldn't demolish it. Callum said nothing. He knew you'd been going back every month for 3 years, and he knew that meant you weren't going to be able to pull that building down, and so he told you what was in the walls so that you'd know. She paused. He was releasing you from having to argue for it. The room was very quiet. I was a complicated man, Callum said finally. Most people who make hard decisions for a long time are. He looked at the folder again. File your application. I am. And I'm going to keep making my case to the council about the medical need. That hasn't changed. I know, but... He was quiet for a moment, the way he was sometimes quiet, not hesitating but choosing. I'm going to recommend to the hospital board that they commission an independent assessment of the adaptive reuse options before the vote, rather than just opposing your application. Wren looked at him. That's a significant shift. It's what the evidence warrants. He stood up. If there's a way to honor both the building and the medical need. I want to know what it is before I tell a council that demolition is the only option. She walked him to the door. On the threshold in the morning light he turned. The window faces east-northeast, he said. I went this morning at 6:30. She looked at him. The light goes right across the floor, he said, like someone knew where it needed to land. He walked down the steps and out onto Abercorn Street, and Wren stood in the doorway and watched him go and thought about W.T. Arden, who had noted in August of 1889 that the window faced the right direction for the morning. The following week had the texture that Wren had learned to recognize as the middle distance of a preservation fight. Not the crisis of the beginning or the clarity of the end, but the long interior stretch where you were working harder than you'd worked at anything, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain and all you could do was keep moving. She filed the amended application on Monday. The Landmarks Review Board scheduled their site visit for the following Thursday. Marcus, the coalition's researcher, was pursuing leads on surviving witnesses who had used the Hartley Chapel. Louise was in daily contact with 2 of the council members whose votes they believed they had secured. The third lot remained opaque. Wren divided her time between the archive, the building, and the phone, with occasional breaks for the real meals that Dottie at the bed and breakfast had begun leaving in the kitchen for her with the passive persistence of a woman who had raised children and recognized the signs. She called Eleanor every morning. Eleanor's voice was different now. Not weaker exactly, but more effortful. The words more carefully chosen, the energy behind them smaller. They talked about the case which Eleanor followed with the attention of someone for whom it was important to follow something. She asked sharp questions about the adaptive reuse argument and the council vote arithmetic, and once on Wednesday about Callum Vane. He shifted, Wren said. He recommended an independent assessment of adaptive reuse options to the hospital board. How did the board respond? They haven't formally responded yet. His colleague Dr. Seth told him privately that he'd put himself in a difficult position with the administration. And how is he? Wren paused. Fine, I think. He's still making the medical case. He was at the council subcommittee meeting yesterday. That's not what I asked. Wren looked out the window of her room. The square was quiet in the morning, a couple walking a dog, the live oaks moving in a faint wind. He's a careful person. He doesn't show much. That's not what I asked either. Eleanor, I'm dying not blind. A slight pause. He matters to the case. Yes, and to you. He's a person I'm working in opposition to who has complicated the situation considerably by being considerably more reasonable than expected. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision of a woman who had spent 74 years thinking clearly, that's the longest way you've ever said yes to anything. The Landmarks Review Board site visit fell on a Thursday, which was also the day Marcus found the witnesses. He found two of them, a woman named Gertrude Cole, 87, living in a retirement community in Augusta, and a man named Isaiah Parks, 84, still in Savannah, in the house where he'd been born. Marcus had traced them through church records and a civil rights oral history project at Savannah State University, and he'd confirmed independently with each of them that they had worshipped in the Hartley Chapel as children, Gertrude at 12 in 1950. Isaiah at 8 in 1949, brought by parents who had used the hospital's colored ward. Their testimony was a document unto itself, which Marcus had recorded and transcribed, and which Wren read in the carriage house at 7 a.m. while the review board was assembling outside. Isaiah Parks had said when asked what he remembered, "It was a small room with a window. My mother took me there when my sister was sick. She said this was the room they gave us, and we should use it right. I remember the cross on the wall. I remember the light coming in." He paused in the recording. "I didn't know they'd sealed it up. I always thought it was still there." Gertrude Cole had said, "My father brought us there twice. He said it wasn't the room they should have given us, but it was given with respect, and that was something. I think about that often. What it means to give something with respect, even when the thing you're giving is less than what's owed." Wren sat with that for a long time. Then she added both transcripts to the application package and went to meet the review board at the fence. The site visit lasted 3 hours. Wren walked the board through the building, 7 people, including an architectural historian, a structural engineer retained by the city, and 3 members whose expertise was in historical significance rather than building assessment. She walked them through the main corridor, the surgical wing, the east staircase, and finally the second-floor corridor where the chapel door stood open, the room visible, the cross still on its wall. The architectural historian stood in the chapel for a long time. The structural engineer ran her hands along the door frame and the wall seam and made notes. One of the historical significance members, a woman named Roberta Ashe, who had written a book on Georgia's civil rights landmarks, crouched on the floor of the chapel and examined the original heart pine boards, and then stood and looked at the window for several seconds without speaking. Callum was not there. He had sent his adaptive reuse report to the board separately submitted formally through the hospital board's channels, and Wren had read it in full that morning. It was thorough and genuinely balanced. It acknowledged the historical significance documentation directly, and proposed 3 options for adaptive reuse, ranging from minimal to substantial preservation, with cost estimates and timeline models for each. The cheapest option preserved the chapel and the east wing facade. The most expensive preserved the original floor plan entirely and integrated the trauma expansion on the adjacent lot. She thought about the fact that he had written that document in the same week that his hospital administration had expressed its displeasure with his position shift, and she thought about what it cost a careful person to do a thing that was right at the expense of a thing that was convenient. And she thought about Eleanor saying, "That's the longest way you've ever said yes to anything." After the review board left, she stood in the chapel alone for a moment. The light was wrong. It was mid-afternoon, the window faced northeast, so the morning quality was entirely absent. But the room held something anyway, the stillness of a place where people had brought the heaviest things they were carrying over and over for years, and where the walls had accepted all of it without judgment and without taking it away. She thought about her father's name in the 1986 maintenance logs. She had not yet looked up the specific record. She had noted it in the first week and had been skirting it since the way you skirted something that might change the shape of what you thought you already knew. She pulled up the digitized maintenance logs on her phone, the 1986 folder, and searched. Thomas Adler, exterior masonry, inspection and repair, East Wing, April 14th, 18th, 1986. 5 days. She tried to remember what she knew of April 1986. She would have been 7. She remembered her father being away for a week in the spring. She remembered her mother being tired and short-tempered in the way she was when he traveled, and the specific character of that tiredness was the tiredness of a woman who managed everything alone and was angry about it and didn't say so. Her father had been in Savannah for 5 days in April 1986, repairing the east wing masonry of a hospital he was about to watch get shuttered a year before the shuttering. She wondered if he'd known about the room. She stood in the chapel with the afternoon light making its wrong-angle version of the morning and thought about calling him. She had his number. She had always had his number. The gap between having it and using it was 4 years wide and had a specific shape she had never entirely explained even to herself. She went back down the east staircase through the corridor out through the fence. She did not call him, not yet, but she thought about it the whole drive back. She found Callum at the hospital that evening. Not by design, but because she'd gone to the medical center's library to request access to their historical photograph collection, which reportedly included images of Hartley during its operational period. And he was in the hallway outside the library door when she came out at 6:30. He looked tired. Not the post-night shift tiredness of their first meeting, but a different kind. The tiredness of someone who had been in difficult conversations all day. The review board site visit went well, she said. I heard. He leaned against the wall. Roberta Ashe called it the most significant civil rights architectural find in Savannah in 20 years. She said that publicly. She said it to me in the hallway outside the board's consultation room at a volume she clearly intended for me to hear. A slight pause. She's not wrong. Wren looked at him. He was wearing scrubs under a white coat, which meant he'd been in the OR today, which meant the day had been layered on top of the political difficulty in a way she recognized was physically exhausting. The hospital board responded to your adaptive reuse report. This afternoon, he said it evenly. They rejected the proposal to commission an independent assessment. Their position is that the adaptive reuse options are not financially viable and introduce unacceptable timeline risk. What's their timeline? They need to break ground by November, or they lose the federal grant that funds the trauma wing expansion. Wren absorbed that. That's real. Yes, I know it's real. He looked at the floor. I wrote the report because the evidence warranted it. The board's financial analysis is also not wrong. Adaptive reuse at the scale that preserves the East Wing and the chapel adds 8 to 12 months to the timeline and between $4 and $7 million to the project cost. That's real money. That's equipment. That's staff. I know. I'm not telling you to back down. I know that too. I was quiet for a moment. A nurse walked past them in the hall and said, Dr. Vane, without stopping the shorthand of a busy department. He nodded without looking. My colleague Priya thinks I've undermined our position, he said. She's not incorrect. The adaptive reuse report gave your team ammunition they wouldn't have had otherwise. You gave us a more accurate picture of the options. That's different from undermining. The practical effect is the same. Wren considered him. He was being precise about this, not self-pitying, not looking for reassurance, just accurate. She appreciated accuracy. The board vote is in 4 weeks, she said. If the landmark designation passes, the demolition permit is blocked, and the hospital has to either pursue adaptive reuse or find another site or another funding arrangement. I know the calendar. Are you going to keep making the medical case to the council? He looked at her. Yes, it's still true. Then we're still on opposite sides of the vote. Yes. He pushed off from the wall. That's not the same thing as being on opposite sides of the problem. She watched him walk back down the hall. The particular walk of a surgeon. She thought deliberate and slightly forward-leaning, a person whose body was accustomed to moving toward difficult things rather than away from them. She drove back to Jones Street and sat at her desk and worked until midnight and ate the food Dottie had left and went to bed and did not dream about anything she could remember. 3 days before the council vote, Marcus found a third witness. Her name was Vera Washington, and she was 91 years old, and she was the daughter of the nurse who had managed the Hartley-colored ward from 1941 to 1958. Vera Washington lived in a house on Gwinnett Street that she had owned since 1971, and she did not want to be interviewed on video, but was willing to talk, and Marcus brought Wren with him. The house was full of plants and light. Vera Washington was small and entirely alert, seated in an armchair with a blanket over her lap and her hands folded and her eyes taking inventory of them both in the first 30 seconds. My mother worked in that hospital for 17 years, she said when Marcus had explained the purpose of the visit. She talked about it until she died. She talked about it particularly. Did she talk about the chapel? Marcus asked. Often. Vera Washington looked at the window. She said it was the one room in the building where people could breathe without permission. Her words. Breathe without permission. She said it was a small room, but it had a window that caught the morning, and that when you were in it, you felt that someone had thought about you, specifically about you. She unfolded and refolded her hands. She said she didn't know who had thought about them, but that she could feel it in the room, that someone had decided they deserved a place with a morning window. Wren did not take notes during that. She let Marcus handle the recorder, and she sat and listened to a 91-year-old woman describe what her mother had told her about a room that had been sealed inside a wall for 63 years. "Did your mother know who built it?" she asked. She knew the architect's name. She said the story was that he'd added it himself quietly because he thought it was right. She said she'd always wanted to thank him, but he was dead by the time she heard. Vera Washington looked at Wren directly. "Is the room still there?" "Yes," Wren said. "It's intact. The cross is still on the wall." Vera Washington was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have liked to know that." They thanked her. On the porch leaving, Vera Washington said, "The people who want to tear the building down, are they bad people?" Wren considered the question honestly. "No. They're trying to solve a real problem. They just think the solution requires the building to come down." "And you think it doesn't?" "I think there are other solutions. Whether we can make the case for them in time is what the next 4 days are about." Vera Washington nodded slowly. "My mother used to say the argument isn't about the building. The argument is about whether the people who built it thought we were worth thinking about, and whether we are." She folded her hands again. "I think we are. I imagine you do too." "Yes," Wren said. "That's exactly what the argument is about." She called Eleanor from the car. Eleanor did not pick up. She called back 20 minutes later when they were back at the carriage house, and Eleanor's voice was slower than it had been, not diminished, but more deliberate, each word carrying its full weight. "I heard you found a third witness," Eleanor said. Her mother worked in the hospital. She talked about the chapel for 60 years. "Good." A pause. "Wren, the vote is in 4 days." "I know. Are you going to be all right if it doesn't go our way?" Wren looked out the carriage house window at the Savannah evening. The particular lavender of a Georgia dusk, the live oaks going still as the wind dropped. "It's going to go our way," she said. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet. "I'll be all right either way. The documentation exists now. Even if the vote fails, the room is in the historical record. The witnesses are on record. The architect's letter is in the public archive. You can't undocument something." "No," Eleanor said. "You can't." A longer pause. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "My father's name is in the 1986 maintenance logs. He worked on the East Wing masonry for 5 days in April of that year." She steadied her voice. "Did you know that when you sent me here?" The pause was longer this time. "I knew his firm had done work on the building," Eleanor said finally. "I didn't know the specific record. I sent you because you were the right person for the job. But you knew. I knew your father had a connection to Savannah. I thought it might matter to you to know it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you directly. I thought you might not come if I did." Wren considered that. "You were probably right. I usually am. It's one of the less endearing things about me." A silence between them that had the warmth of a long acquaintance. "Call your father," Eleanor said. "Before the vote. Not because of the building, because 4 years is long enough." "Eleanor, I have opinions, and I'm using them. This is what dying does for you. Everyone has to listen." Her voice softened. "Call him. The worst thing that happens is the conversation is difficult. You've been having difficult conversations all month." After they hung up, Wren sat at her desk for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her father. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting, or had always been waiting, which was a different and more complicated thing. "Wren Chot," he said. "Hi, Dad." The conversation lasted 47 minutes, which was 45 minutes longer than she'd expected it to last. And it was difficult in the way Eleanor had predicted and not difficult in the way Wren had feared. Her father was 68 years old, and he was in good health, and he was living in the same house in Chestnut Hill where she had grown up, the house her mother had kept painting over the cracks. He had retired from contracting 3 years ago, and he was doing something with woodworking. Now he said small furniture, nothing commercial. He said it carefully in the way that people who have decided to be careful say things. "The 1986 job," she said eventually. A pause. "You found that. Your name is in the maintenance logs, East Wing Masonry, April." "I was there for a week." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother and I were having a hard year. I took the job partly to have somewhere to be." She had not known that. She had known the hard years in the way children knew things, impressionistically, without detail, the emotional weather of a household rather than its causes. "Were you inside the building much?" "Every day. It was good work." The brick was original, 1889 Savannah gray. "I'd never worked with it before." He paused again. "On the last day before I packed up, the building manager showed me something. A room on the second floor. He said it was going to be sealed when the hospital closed the next year, and he wanted someone to know it was there." Wren was very still. Did you go in? Yes. What did you see? A small room, a window to the east, a cross on the south wall. His voice was steady and unhurried. The manager told me what it was, what it had been used for. A pause. I was 39 years old, and I stood in that room for about 10 minutes, and then I thanked him and drove home, and I didn't talk about it for 40 years. Why not? It was quiet long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. Then, I didn't know how to talk about something that wasn't mine. The room wasn't my history. I was just a contractor who happened to see it. Another pause. I thought about it often, though. I thought about whoever had decided that window should face east. Wren pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead. I'm trying to save the building, she said. The room is the center of the landmark application. We have the foreman's notes, the architect's letter, 3 witnesses. She took a breath. Would you be willing to give testimony, written or video? What you saw, what the building manager told you. A long silence. Yes, her father said. If it helps. It helps. Another silence, but different. The silence of 2 people who had been in the same room again after 4 years away from it, deciding what to do next. The building manager, Wren said. Do you remember his name? Anderson. Robert Anderson. He died sometime in the 90s, I think. She wrote it down anyway. Okay, I'll follow up. Wren. He said her name the way he had always said it, with the slight forward lean of a man who found directness easier than approach. I'm glad you called. I'm glad I called too. She hung up and sat at her desk for a long time in the Savannah evening, the window open, the live oaks moving outside. She was thinking about her father standing in a room in 1986 for 10 minutes, thinking about something that wasn't his history, but that had landed in him and stayed. She was thinking about the way some things traveled through time inside people, not as stories, but as weight, as the particular quality of a moment that didn't dissolve. She was also thinking about Callum Vane's grandfather, who had worked in that building for 22 years and known what was behind the wall. Some people held things until they could give them to the right person. She opened her laptop and began drafting the addendum to the landmark application that would include her father's testimony. She worked until 1 a.m. Outside, Savannah quieted around her, and the live oaks went still, and somewhere in the dark, the old hospital stood with its doors open and its morning window facing the right direction, waiting for what came next. The email chain surfaced on a Monday, 11 days before the council vote, and it did not come from Wren. It came from a man named Gregory Farr, who had been a city planning aide in 2009 and who had apparently been waiting 17 years for a reason to use what he had. He sent it to the Savannah Morning News and to 3 council members and to the Hartley Coalition simultaneously, which meant Wren found out about it from Louise at 7:15 a.m. in the same moment that her phone started lighting up with news alerts. The chain was 8 emails. The relevant passage was in the 6th, a message from a lobbyist working for a property development group addressed to Warren Lott, which read in part, as discussed, the Meridian Group's appreciation for your support on the Henderson Street matter is reflected in the arrangement we spoke about. We trust the Hartley question when it arises will be handled with similar consideration. The Henderson Street matter had been a 2009 demolition permit for a historically significant Victorian block issued over preservation objections. The permit had passed on a 4-3 council vote. Warren Lott had been the 4th vote. Wren read the email chain twice on her phone while standing in the kitchen at Jones Street, the coffee going cold in her hand. Then she called Louise. I didn't send it, Louise said before Wren could speak. I know. Gregory Farr worked for the planning department in 2009 and was apparently the aide who handled the Henderson Street file. He's been sitting on this for 17 years. What does Lott say? Nothing yet. His office released a statement saying he's reviewing the materials. The mayor's office has asked the council to delay any action pending review. Wren sat down. If Lott recuses himself, we lose the 4-3 math. We lose the assumption of it. The vote becomes genuinely uncertain in a different way. We need to win on the merits with whoever's left, who fills the seat. If Lott recuses the council chair, appoints a temporary voting member from a list of alternates. We don't know who that would be. Wren pressed her fingers to her forehead. The vote is in 11 days. I know. Do we have grounds to request a delay? Louise was quiet for a moment. We could argue that the composition of the voting body has materially changed, and the parties need time to assess. The hospital board will argue against any delay because their grant timeline is tight. What do you want to do? I want to win on the merits, Louise said. I always want to win on the merits. If we ask for a delay, it looks like we're afraid of the current council composition. A pause. What do you want to do? Wren looked out the kitchen window. The square was just beginning, a man walking a terrier, the bakery across the street, turning its lights on a cyclist moving through the early morning in the particular silence of someone who has the city to themselves. I want to let it play, she said. We have the documentation, we have the witnesses, we have a structural assessment and an adaptive reuse report from the opposing side's own lead advocate. If we can't win on that basis without Lott, we were never going to win with him. All right, Louise said, that's what we do. She told Callum in person. She'd begun doing that, telling him things in person rather than by text without entirely deciding to. They had developed a habit over the past 2 weeks of meeting at Hartley in the early morning before either of them had other obligations ostensibly to discuss the case, but increasingly to think out loud at each other in a space that both of them, she suspected, found easier to think in than their respective offices. She found him at the fence at 6:50 a.m., already through the gap, standing in the main corridor with his second coffee of the morning. She told him about the email chain. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was his default mode when receiving difficult information, the surgeon's discipline of taking the complete picture before responding. How does it affect your position? She asked when she'd finished. It doesn't change the medical case. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It changes the optics. The hospital board is already being painted as moneyed interests against preservation. Now there's a question of whether those interests also bought a council vote in 2009. He looked at her. I didn't know about any of this. I know you didn't. The board. He stopped. I don't know what the board knew. I want to be clear that I'm not the board. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment. You've known that since the beginning. Yes. He nodded slowly. If Lott recuses and the alternate is someone with strong development ties, you're in trouble. If the alternate is someone with historical preservation sympathies, you're in trouble. We're both at the mercy of a process that neither of us controls, he said with the particular tone of someone identifying an irony rather than complaining about it. Welcome to preservation work. She finished her coffee. What are you going to do? Keep making the medical case. Keep advocating for the adaptive reuse assessment, even though the board rejected it. He looked toward the East Wing. And hope the vote is decided by the strength of the arguments. When has it ever been decided by that? Almost never, he said. But you have to behave as if it will be, or you become the person who decides it doesn't matter how you behave. She looked at him in the early light, the particular light of a Savannah morning that was different from any other light she knew, the humidity softening everything, the live oaks filtering the gold. He was looking at the East Wing with an expression she'd come to recognize, the complex one, the one that contained his grandfather, and the room, and the patients, and the weight of the argument, all at once, the expression of someone who had not found a clean resolution and had stopped looking for one. My father is going to give testimony, she said. He looked at her. Your father. His name is in the 1986 maintenance logs. He did masonry work on the East Wing. The building manager showed him the chapel before it was sealed. He stood in the room. She paused. We didn't talk for 4 years. I called him last week. Callum was quiet for a moment. How was that? Difficult. And not as difficult as I expected. She looked at the building. He said the building manager told him what the room had been. He said he stood in it for 10 minutes and thought about the person who had decided the window should face east. Callum said nothing, but she saw something move through his expression, not sentimentality, but recognition. The particular recognition of a person who understood what it meant to stand in a space and feel the decisions that had been made before you. He'll do a video statement, she said. Marcus is setting it up. Good. He turned back toward the exit. I need to be in the OR at 7:30. I know. At the fence, he turned. The email chain FAR sent it to 3 council members directly. That means it's in their hands now regardless of what Lott does. Yes, the ones whose votes you have. They already know about the 2009 connection. Yes, which means the question was never really about Lott. Wren looked at him. No, it was always going to come down to whoever was persuadable. He nodded. Then make the strongest case you can. He went through the fence and walked to his car without looking back, and Wren stood at the gap in the chain link and listened to Savannah wake up around her and thought about persuadability and what it required. Warren Lott recused himself on Thursday. He did it quietly, a statement released through his office at 4 p.m. noting that given questions about past conduct, he felt it was appropriate to step aside from this particular vote. He did not admit to anything. He expressed support for both the preservation community and the hospital's medical mission in language so carefully both-sided that it said nothing at all. The council chair appointed the alternate the following morning. A woman named Patricia Dent, 62, retired Georgia State archivist. Louise called Wren with the news at 8 a.m. Archivist, Wren said. Retired state archivist. She spent 30 years at the Georgia Archives in Morrow. Her work focused on civil rights documentation. Louise's voice was carefully neutral. She has no recorded public position on the Hartley question, but she spent 30 years preserving civil rights records. That's a fact, yes. Wren looked at the ceiling of her room. The hospital board is going to challenge the appointment. They already have. Their attorney filed this morning, arguing that her professional background constitutes a conflict of interest. A pause. The council chair denied the challenge. The vote proceeds as scheduled. 8 days. Louise, Wren said, we're going to win. Don't say that until it's done. I know, but I think we're going to win. Louise was quiet for a moment. I think so too. Don't say it out loud again until it's done. The week before the vote had a different quality than the weeks before it. Not calmer, the phone calls were constant. The documentation requests from the Landmarks Review Board were ongoing. Patricia Dent's office sent 3 rounds of questions that Wren answered in writing with the thoroughness of someone who understood that thoroughness was its own argument. But there was a sense of the shape of things settling the narrative, finding its form. She worked. She ate. She called Eleanor every morning. Eleanor's voice was slower now, and she often fell asleep mid-call, which she apologized for in the brusque way of a woman who found the body's failures annoying rather than frightening. They did not talk about Callum Vane again directly, but Wren mentioned him often enough in passing that Eleanor's silence on the subject had its own quality. Callum came to Hartley most mornings. Sometimes they talked for an hour. Sometimes they were both in the building, simultaneously working on separate things. He had begun quietly to document the building's features with his own camera. Not for the preservation argument, but for something else she hadn't asked about. One morning, she found him photographing the original terrazzo floor in the main corridor, crouching close to document the pattern, and she watched him do it for a minute before he heard her and stood. For me, he said, slightly self-conscious. Not for any official purpose. The pattern is worth documenting, she said. It's a Minton variant. There aren't many intact examples left. I know. My grandfather talked about it. He looked at the floor. He said when he was a resident before the hospital closed, the older staff would navigate by landmarks in the floor. This section means you're 3 doors from surgery. That section means you're near the pharmacy. Everyone knew the code. Institutional memory, Wren said. It lives in material objects. That's the whole argument. He looked at her. I know the argument. I've been listening to you make it for 5 weeks. And I was quiet for a moment. And I think you're right that the room is irreplaceable. I think the medical need is also real and also urgent. I think those things are both true at the same time, and I've stopped pretending that one cancels out the other. She looked at him. The morning light was coming in through the clear estuary. They'd repaired the broken panes. The coalition had funded the stabilization work, and the windows were sealed now, the light clean and whole. What happens if we win the vote? The demolition permit is blocked. The hospital board has to find another path. Different site, different funding arrangement, adaptive reuse. He met her eyes. They'll come back to the adaptive reuse option. When they're not fighting the landmark designation, they'll see it's the only path that doesn't mean losing the grant. And you'll advocate for it. I've been advocating for it for 3 weeks. They'll come around when they don't have another choice. A slight pause. The trauma bays still get built. It just takes longer and costs more and requires someone to care enough to push the board toward the harder option. He looked at her. I can be that person. She was very aware of the quality of his voice when he said that, not performing, not managing, just stating a fact about himself with the particular quiet of someone who had made a decision and wasn't asking for credit for it. You'd be fighting your own administration, she said. I've been fighting my own administration for 3 weeks. It's not comfortable, but it's not unbearable. A pause. My grandfather spent 22 years in this building advocating for things the administration didn't want to hear. He didn't think he was doing anything exceptional. He thought he was doing his job. Wren thought about that. About the long inheritance of doing the difficult thing quietly and without announcement passing it on. Not as a story, but as a standard. The vote is in 5 days, she said. I know. Are you ready? He looked around the main corridor, the repaired windows, the intact terrazzo, the chandelier frame still hanging precisely centered from the ceiling. Still exactly where the person who installed it had decided it should go. I've been ready since my grandfather told me about the room, he said. I just didn't know what I was ready for. She held that. Outside, Savannah was going about its morning, the squares full of joggers and dog walkers and people with coffee. The live oaks doing what they always did. The city continuous and unhurried, absorbing the present, the way it absorbed everything without being altered by it. Callum, she said. He looked at her. Thank you for the adaptive reuse report, for the board recommendation, for not being the person I thought you might be when I first walked in here. I was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not surprise, but the careful movement of a person who was deciding how directly to respond. You were never what I thought you'd be either, he said. I thought you'd be an idealist, someone who loved buildings more than people. And you're someone who loves what buildings say about people. He paused. That's different. She held his gaze for a moment. The light was very good. 5 days, she said. 5 days, he said. She went back to work. He went to the hospital. Outside, the live oaks kept doing what they'd been doing for 100 years, holding the squares in their shade, making the particular dappled dark that Savannah was known for, and that no one who had seen it properly ever forgot. The building waited. 4 days. 3. 2. The night before the vote, Wren could not sleep. She was accustomed to sleeplessness before council decisions. It was one of the occupational textures of this work. The hours between midnight and dawn, when the argument lived entirely in your head with no way to make it better or worse. She'd done 47 of these, and she'd been awake the night before, most of them turning the evidence over, running the logic again, looking for the gap she might have missed. She got up at 1 a.m. and went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the small table with her laptop and the full application file open in front of her. Not reading it. She knew it by heart, but present with it. The way you stayed with something you'd worked on for a long time before releasing it. The structural assessment, the foreman's ledger, the architect's letter, the photographs of the chapel, the cross, the window, the heart pine floor, the testimonies of Gertrude Cole, Isaiah Parks, Vera Washington, her father's video statement, which she had watched 3 times in editing, and in which Thomas Adler sat in his Chestnut Hill kitchen and described in the careful, measured voice of a man who chose his words, standing in a small room in a shuttered hospital in Savannah in April of 1986. Thinking about the person who had put the window where the window needed to be. Callum's adaptive reuse report. She'd read it 5 times. It was the most useful document in her application package, and it had come from the other side, and that was either a grace or an irony or both. Her phone lit up. A text at 1:17 a.m. Are you awake? She looked at it. Callum. She wrote back, yes. A pause. Then, I'm at the building. She sat with that for a moment. Then she closed her laptop, put on shoes, and walked the 6 blocks. I was inside in the main corridor, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and a flashlight angled at the ceiling. He looked up when she came in through the gap. She sat down on the floor beside him, a foot of space between them. They were quiet for a while. The building made its small nighttime sounds. The streetlight came through the repaired clerestory in clean parallelograms now, proper light, not the fractured light of the broken panes. I keep thinking about what happens if it goes the wrong way, he said. Which wrong way? Either. He looked at the ceiling. If you lose, the building comes down and everything in it. If I lose, the trauma center gets delayed by years minimum. People will make decisions about where to come based on our capacity, and some of those decisions will cost time that costs lives. He paused. I've been making the medical argument for 2 years. I know all the ways the wrong outcome looks. So do I. She looked up at the chandelier frame. The wrong outcome on my side is a building that's documented but gone. The wrong outcome on your side is a building that stands while people die for want of what it's blocking. Yes, the right outcome is the adaptive reuse. It costs more and takes longer and requires the hospital board to accept a timeline they don't want. Yes, and it's the only option that honors both things. Yes. He looked at the chandelier. I know that. I've known it since I wrote the report. A pause. I think the board knows it too. I think they've been hoping the vote goes against you so they don't have to admit it. Wren considered that. And if the vote goes for us, then they have to admit it. He said it without bitterness. And we do the harder thing and build the right building instead of the easy one. She looked at him in the low light. He was in dark jeans and an old shirt, the kind of clothes he wore when he wasn't being a surgeon or a council witness. Just a person in a building. He'd been coming back to for 3 years because something in him refused to let it go. Why did you keep coming back? She asked. Before I arrived, before any of this. He thought about it. Because my grandfather loved this building. And I didn't understand why, and I thought if I kept showing up, I'd eventually figure it out. He turned his head to look at her. I think I understand now. What is it? The building held things, he said, not in the sentimental way. In the literal way, it held what happened inside it. The terrazzo holds the navigation system. The walls hold the chapel. The foreman's ledger holds a decision about a window. He was quiet for a moment. My grandfather held the knowledge of the room for 40 years. People who worshipped there held the memory for their whole lives. Things get passed forward through whatever medium will carry them. He paused. The building was the medium. Wren was quiet. That's the whole argument, he said. Yes, she said. That's the whole argument. They sat with it for a while. 1:50 a.m. in a shuttered hospital in Savannah, Georgia, the live oaks outside doing what live oaks do. The city asleep around them, the building holding them both in the way that it had held everything, without judgment, without preference, simply present. I should go home, Callum said without moving. Probably. Neither of them moved for another few minutes. Then he stood and she stood, and they went out through the gap in the fence together. On the sidewalk, in the orange light of the street lamp, he turned to look at her. Regardless of what happens tomorrow, he said. She waited. I'm glad you came here. He said it directly, which was the way he said things that mattered. I would have spent another year coming to this building alone and not understanding what I was looking at. She held his gaze. The street was empty, Savannah breathing quietly around them in the warm dark. You would have figured it out eventually, she said. Maybe. A slight pause. But I'm glad it was faster. He walked to his car. She walked back to Jones Street. Neither of them said anything else, but there was something in the silence that had a different quality than the silence had had before, the particular texture of two people who have stopped pretending they don't know what's happening. She went to bed at 2:30 and was asleep by 2:35, which was the fastest she'd fallen asleep since arriving in Savannah. The day of the vote. She woke at 5:30 and lay in bed listening to the square outside for exactly 15 minutes, and then got up and showered and dressed and ate the breakfast Dottie had left for her without being asked, and walked to the carriage house. Louise was already there. They went through the presentation one final time, not because either of them needed to, but because going through it was a way of being steady. Marcus arrived at 7. He had spoken to Gertrude Cole the night before, and she had asked him to tell Wren that she would be thinking of them. At 8:30, Wren called her father. Today, us, he said. Today. She sat in the carriage house with the morning coming through the window, the Savannah light doing what it did. Your statement is in the record. It's been submitted and acknowledged. Good. A pause. I watched the video back. I looked old. You looked like someone who remembered something important and was telling the truth about it. I was quiet for a moment. Will you call after? Yes. Okay. Another pause. Wren, whatever happens, you did the work right. She held the phone for a moment after they hung up, thinking about what that meant from a man who had spent his life doing physical work and for whom right had a specific and non-negotiable meaning. At 9 a.m., she walked to City Hall and went inside. The council chamber was not large, a municipal meeting room, not a court. The council members at a curved table, the audience chairs behind a low railing. Both sides had their people, the preservation community on the left, the hospital board's representatives on the right, members of the public scattered through the remaining seats. Vera Washington was there, which Wren had not expected, small and alert in a chair near the aisle, her hands folded in her lap. Callum was on the right side of the room behind the hospital board table in a dark suit. He caught her eye when she came in and held it for a second. She nodded. He nodded. Patricia Dent sat at the center of the council table and looked precisely like a woman who had spent 30 years handling irreplaceable documents and was not impressed by the difficulty of the situation. The proceedings began at 9:15. Wren had presented at 47 council sessions. She had never once thought that the work of making the argument was the same as the work of sitting through someone else making the counter-argument and not being able to respond. That was the peculiar discipline of these formal proceedings. The constraint of the form, the taking of turns, the careful structure that prevented the kind of exchange that actually happened in the real world. The hospital board's attorney presented first the medical need data, the mortality statistics, the grant timeline, the cost projections. He was good, efficient, factual, unemotional. The numbers were what they were. He did not minimize the building's significance. He acknowledged the chapel discovery directly and said carefully that it added a dimension of historical importance that the board respected while maintaining that the medical need was not superseded by architectural or historical considerations, however significant. Then he did something Wren had not expected. He read a paragraph from Callum's adaptive reuse report, the section where Callum acknowledged the chapel's historical significance explicitly and noted that it represented a community's relationship to an institution that had both served and failed them. The attorney read it without comment and moved on. The council chair looked at Callum briefly, and Callum's face showed nothing at all. Then Wren presented. She had 45 minutes, and she used 35 of them. She went through the documentary evidence methodically, without drama. The foreman's ledger, the architect's letter, the structural assessment, the adaptive reuse report. She played the 3 witness testimonies in sequence: Gertrude Cole, Isaiah Parks, Thomas Adler. When her father's voice filled the council chamber, careful, unhurried, describing a room with a window facing east and a cross on the wall, she watched Patricia Dent's face and saw something move through it that was not sentiment but recognition. She closed with Vera Washington's mother's words, which she had asked Vera's permission to quote. "The argument isn't about the building. The argument is about whether the people who built it thought we were worth thinking about, and whether we are." She sat down. The council deliberated for 50 minutes. Wren sat in her chair and did not move. Louise sat beside her and did not move either. On the other side of the room, the hospital board's representatives talked quietly among themselves. Callum sat slightly apart from them, his hands on the table looking at the wall. The council returned. Patricia Dent read the decision, 4 votes to 3, landmark designation approved. The room shifted a breath. A murmur, nothing dramatic. On the left side, Louise put her hand over Wren's on the table. Wren left it there. Across the room, the hospital board's lead representative was already on his phone. Callum was looking at Wren. She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between them. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but the complex acknowledgement of 2 people who had been arguing from opposite sides of a real problem and had arrived somewhere that was not quite either of their answers and was perhaps better than both. She nodded. He nodded. Then she turned to Louise, and the practical work of what came next began. On the day of the vote itself, Wren had not gone back to the building. That had been a deliberate choice, the first time in 6 weeks. She'd made it through a full day without entering the space. She had needed to be present in the formal world of council chambers and documentation and the careful procedures of civic decision-making, and she had known that going to Hartley first thing would put her in the wrong register for what the day required. The building made her think slowly and carefully. The council chamber required a different quality of attention. So she had stayed at the carriage house through the morning, reviewing the presentation one final time, and then she had walked to City Hall and she had made her argument, and the vote had gone the way it went, 4 to 3. Landmark status approved. The practical work that followed was immediate and total notification to the demolition permit office that the permit application was now blocked. Formal communication to the hospital board. Filing with the Landmarks Review Board for the formal designation certificate. Press outreach from the coalition, which Louise had been drafting for both outcomes since the night before. Wren handled her part of it from a table in a coffee shop on Bull Street because she needed to be somewhere with good Wi-Fi and a strong coffee and no symbolic wait. She did not want to be in the building for this part. This part was logistics. By 4 p.m., the most urgent communications were out, and she was on her 3rd coffee, and her phone had received 47 text messages, and she had responded to 11 of them. The 12th was from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Gertrude Cole's cell phone she'd had her granddaughter text. "We heard. Thank you." The 13th was from Isaiah Parks, who had typed in full sentences. "Louise told me the outcome. The room is safe. My mother would have been glad." Wren set her phone down on the table and looked out the window at Johnson Square, the same square she had looked at on the day of the preliminary planning session through the City Hall window, before she and Callum had been anything other than adversaries. The square was doing what squares do. The live oaks were in their permanent motion. A man was walking a bicycle through the center path. A child was running circles around one of the benches, while her parent watched from a distance with the specific posture of a parent who has decided the risk is acceptable. Everything continuing. She thought about Patricia Dent, the retired archivist, voting to designate the building, casting the 4th vote, the one that made the difference. She thought about what it meant that the person who had decided this question had spent 30 years preserving civil rights records in Georgia. She thought about the particular way history accumulated not linearly, not predictably, but through the slow accretion of decisions made by people who had done their jobs carefully and had passed what they found to the next person. W.T. Arden, who had written it down. Herschel Groves, who had built the room. the families who had worshipped there for years, the nurses and doctors who had walked those halls, James Vane, who had known what was behind the wall, Robert Anderson, who had shown it to a contractor from Philadelphia, Thomas Adler, who had stood in it for 10 minutes and remembered, Eleanor Parrish, who had sent Wren to find it, Patricia Dent, who had understood what finding it meant, a chain of people doing their jobs correctly and passing the result forward. That was what preservation was. That was all it ever was. She finished her coffee and paid her bill and walked back to Jones Street. Louise had organized a gathering that evening at the carriage house. Nothing large, just the coalition's core people, plus a few supporters from the historical community. Wren arrived late, which she had been warned she would do and had done anyway. The room was warm with people, and there was food on the table, and someone had brought champagne, which was not Wren's drink, but which she accepted because Louise handed it to her with the particular look of a woman who had been fighting this fight for 15 years and was not going to be talked out of champagne. 4-3, Louise said again. 4-3, Wren said. Marcus gave a brief account of how they'd found Gertrude Cole and Isaiah Parks, which everyone in the room already knew, but which was better for being said aloud in the right company. Roberta Ashe, who had sent a note saying she was in Atlanta but wished she could be there, had instead sent a bottle of very good scotch, which was passed around. An hour and Wren stepped outside into the Abercorn Street evening. Callum was there. She had not expected him. She hadn't known whether he would come, whether the gathering felt like something he was part of or something that was on the other side of a line he needed to maintain for the sake of his hospital relationships. She had not asked. She had let it be whatever it was going to be. I was sitting on the steps with a glass of water looking at the street. He looked up when she came out. You came, she said. Louise invited me. He said it simply. I thought about whether to come and decided the thing I'd tell a patient to do was to go to the gathering instead of sitting at home thinking about it. What are you telling patients these days? To do the harder thing. It's generally the right advice. He moved over on the step. She sat beside him. The street was quiet, the evening Savannah version of quiet. Not empty but settled. A couple walking past with takeout containers. The sound of something musical from a bar on the next block, faint and good. The board meets next week, he said. I've already drafted my recommendation for the Adaptive Reuse Assessment Commission. You drafted it before the vote. Yes. He glanced at her. I wanted to have it ready, confident, prepared. A slight distinction in his voice. There's a difference. She looked at the live oaks across the street moving in the evening wind. She thought about all the things that had needed to be exactly what they were for this to have gone the way it went. The foreman who had kept a ledger, the architect who had written a letter, the building manager who had shown a contractor a room, a grandfather who had told his grandson at the right moment, a 91-year-old woman on Gwinnett Street who had remembered what her mother told her about a morning window, and this man beside her who had written an adaptive reuse report for a building he'd spent 2 years arguing against because the evidence warranted it. And he was the kind of person who followed evidence even when it was inconvenient. Thank you, she said. He looked at her. For what specifically? For the report. For the board recommendation. For coming tonight. She paused. For being the kind of person who does the thing the evidence warrants. I was quiet for a moment. In the bar on the next block, the music shifted to something slower, something with a piano. The Savannah evening absorbed it without comment. My grandfather used to say that the worst medical decisions he ever saw were made by people who had already decided what the answer was before they looked at the patient, Callum said. He said you had to look at the patient, every time, even when you were tired, even when you thought you already knew. He looked at the street. I spent 2 years looking at the building and seeing the problem I wanted to solve rather than the building as it was. You saw it eventually. You opened the door. She looked at him. He looked back. Literally, she said. Yes. A slight lift of his voice, the equivalent in him of something warmer. Literally. She let that settle. The music played. The live oaks moved. The city continued. Come back inside, she said. There's food. In a minute. He looked at the street. I want to sit here for another minute. She stayed beside him. They didn't talk. The evening did what evenings in Savannah did, absorbed everything. Held everything, let nothing be entirely resolved and nothing be entirely lost. After a while, they went back inside. Eleanor died on a Thursday, 9 days after the vote. Wren was still in Savannah. She had extended her stay twice, once for the post-vote documentation work, once without a named reason, and she was at her desk in the carriage house at 6 a.m. when her phone rang, and the number was Eleanor's home phone, and she already knew. Eleanor's niece, a woman named Sarah, who had been managing the practical arrangements for the past 2 months, told her gently and thoroughly the way people tell things they have been preparing to say. Eleanor had died overnight peacefully in her own house in the room she'd asked to be in. She had left instructions. One of them was that Wren should finish the Hartley work before she came back for the service. Wren sat at her desk for a long time after the call. Then she looked at her laptop screen, which had Eleanor's preservation database open on one side and the post-vote documentation framework on the other. And she understood that Eleanor had known this was how it would be, that the dying would coincide with the doing, because Eleanor had arranged her whole life around the coincidence of those things. She called Sarah back and confirmed the service date 2 weeks out in Philadelphia, and confirmed that she would be there. Then she sat some more. At 7:30, her phone showed a text from Callum. "Are you in today?" She wrote back, "Yes. My mentor died last night." The response came quickly. "I'm sorry. I'll bring food at noon." He came at 12 with 2 containers from the same place on MLK Boulevard she'd been eating from since her first week, and he set them on the table in the carriage house and didn't say anything consoling or constructive, which was exactly right. They ate together in a comfortable quiet. The work spread around them, the Savannah noon heat pressing against the old brick walls. After a while, Callum said, "What was she like?" Wren thought about it. She was the kind of person who knew things and didn't waste them. She had strong opinions about buildings and about people, and she treated both with the same precision. She paused. "She sent me here because she knew I was the right person for the job, and because she knew my father had worked on this building, and she thought I needed to know that." She looked at her rice and beans. "She didn't ask my permission to arrange things. She just arranged them and trusted me to figure out why. She was right that you were the right person." She usually was. Wren looked out the window. She said once that preservation work was the practice of arguing that the dead had something left to say. She said that was either the most important argument or the most indulgent, depending on what the dead had actually said. "Which is Hartley. The most important." She said it without hesitation. The room behind that wall was the dead saying exactly what they needed to say. The architect's letter. The foreman's notes. Your grandfather's testimony through you. She looked at him. It was all the dead having something left to say. Callum was quiet for a moment. My grandfather would have liked Eleanor. He had the same quality, knowing things and not wasting them. She smiled slightly. Stubborn people of principle. There should be more of them. There are. They just don't announce themselves. She looked at him across the table, the afternoon light on his face, the quality of his attention, the particular stillness that she had come to recognize as one of his best characteristics, the ability to be fully in a moment without performing it. "The hospital board called this morning," she said. "I know. I talked to their director yesterday evening. And," he set down his fork, "they want to begin the adaptive reuse assessment within 30 days. They've identified a project management firm with healthcare construction experience. The preliminary conversation is about preserving the chapel and the east wing facade while adding the trauma expansion on the adjacent city parcel." Wren looked at him. "The city agreed to make the adjacent parcel available. The mayor's office agreed to it in principle yesterday. It required..." He paused. "It required a phone call from a city council member who had just voted for the landmark designation and who told the mayor's chief of staff that facilitating the trauma expansion on alternative land was the right thing to do and the city should do it. Patricia Dent. Patricia Dent." He said it with a slight lift of his voice that in him was the equivalent of a broad smile in someone else. Wren sat back. "You got both things. The assessment still has to happen. The cost estimate has to be confirmed. The grant body has to agree to a timeline extension, which they haven't yet." He was precise about it, as he always was. "But the path exists now. It didn't 2 weeks ago. It existed in your report 2 weeks ago. On paper, now it has political support and a parcel and a 30-day timeline." He looked at her. "That's different from paper." She understood the difference. She had lived the difference her whole career, the moment when a document became a decision, when a documented argument became a material fact. "Rennert," he said. She looked at him. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly so there's no ambiguity." She waited. "The work brought me here. The work kept me here. But at this point..." He paused, finding the right precision. "At this point, the work is not why I want to keep showing up to that building at 6 in the morning." The carriage house was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was going through its catalog in a live oak, the particular relentless musicality of the Savannah spring. "I know," she said. "You know what I mean." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I also know your life is in Philadelphia." "My job was in Philadelphia." She said it carefully. Eleanor's institute is going to need someone to run it. I'm not sure that's me. I've never run an organization. I've always done field work. But I'm not sure it isn't me either. She looked at her hands. I've also been thinking about the fact that Savannah has a great deal of historic building stock in various states of distress, and no preservation architect currently working in the city. I was quiet for a moment. Are you telling me you're thinking about staying? I'm telling you I haven't decided yet. She met his eyes. I'm telling you that there are more reasons to stay than there were 4 weeks ago. He looked at her for a long moment, the complex expression, the one that held everything. Okay, he said, take the time you need. I'm going to Philadelphia next week for Eleanor's service. I know. I'll be back the week after. I know that too. A slight pause. I'll be at the building. She smiled. I know. The service for Eleanor Parish was held at a small Quaker meeting house in West Philadelphia that Eleanor had attended irregularly for 30 years on the grounds that Quakers believed in silence, and silence was underrated. 40 people came. Sarah had organized it simply as Eleanor would have wanted: no program, no formal eulogies, just the meeting house, and its silence, and the people who had known Eleanor speaking when they had something to say. Wren spoke for 4 minutes. She talked about what Eleanor had taught her about buildings, not the technical knowledge which could be learned from books, but the discipline of attention, the practice of looking at something made by human hands and asking what it was trying to say. She talked about the Hartley Chapel and what Eleanor had known about it and why she had sent Wren to find it. She talked about a woman who believed that the dead had something left to say and had spent her life ensuring that it got said. She did not cry during the 4 minutes. She cried for about 20 minutes afterward in the small garden behind the meeting house, and Eleanor's niece sat with her without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. On the train back to 30th Street Station, she looked out the window at the industrial terrain of West Philadelphia, the brick row houses, the old factory buildings, the water tower on an abandoned textile mill with its faded painted name still legible after 80 years, and felt the particular quality of grief that came not from loss alone, but from the recognition of a thing as shaped as intended, as complete. Eleanor had lived with full commitment to what she believed, and she had spent her last capacity sending Wren to a building that needed someone who would understand it. The life had a form. It had been lived on purpose. She called her father from the train. It was a good service, she told him. She sounds like she was worth grieving for, he said. She was. A pause. Dad, I'm thinking about staying in Savannah, opening a practice there. Silence. Then the building. Partly. And other work, there's a lot there that needs someone to pay attention to it. She looked out the window. And other reasons. Another pause in which her father did not ask what the other reasons were, because he was a person who understood that some information was offered when it was ready and not before. When would you decide? I have some things to think through first. I'll know by the end of the month. Okay. A pause. The house here has good light. If you ever need somewhere to work from when you're up this way. She sat with that. The house in Chestnut Hill with its good light, her childhood home, the house her mother had kept painting over the cracks. 4 years of distance and a 47-minute phone call and a video testimony given from the kitchen table, and this, the house has good light. Thank you, she said. Travel safe, he said, and hung up in the way he'd always hung up, efficiently, without fuss, having said what needed to be said. She watched West Philadelphia give way to the industrial corridor and then to the beginnings of South Jersey. The flat spring landscape, unremarkable and familiar and oddly beautiful, in the way that unremarkable things were beautiful when you were looking at them through the right kind of grief. She thought about Savannah. She thought about the building. She thought about a man in a dark shirt sitting on the floor of an empty hospital at 1 in the morning, understanding finally what he'd been coming back to look for. She turned her face back to the window and watched New Jersey go by, and thought about light and the directions things faced, and what it meant that someone had decided 130 years ago that the window should face east. It had mattered then. It still mattered now. That was the whole argument. She came back to Savannah on a Tuesday, arrived at the bed and breakfast at 2 p.m., left her bag in her room, and walked to the building. The chain-link fence had been moved. There was a construction site assessment team doing preliminary measurements on the adjacent parcel. 4 people in hard hats with survey equipment, methodical and professional. One of them looked up and nodded at her. She nodded back and went through the gap in the original fence and into the building. It smelled different. The stabilization work had been completed on the windows, and the roof had been partially tarped, pending the full assessment, and the air inside was drier than it had been, less alive with the particular damp of a building left open to the Georgia climate. The quality of the silence was different too, not the waiting silence of the first morning, but something more settled. A building that knew something was being decided. She walked to the east staircase and up to the second floor and down the corridor to the chapel. The door was open. They'd left it open after the site visit. She went in. The morning window was wrong, again. It was 2 p.m., the angle all wrong, but the room held its quality regardless of the time of day. The cross on the wall. The heart pine floor. The window frame original, the glass intact. She heard footsteps on the stair and turned. Callum came down the corridor and stopped in the doorway. He was in scrubs, which meant he'd come from the hospital, which meant he'd come directly. "You're back," he said. "I'm back." He looked at her for a moment. Then he came into the room and stood beside her and looked at the cross on the wall. "The assessment team is outside," he said. "I saw them. They're estimating a 14-month timeline for the full project. 12 if the grant extension comes through." He paused. "The grant body called yesterday. They're inclined to approve the extension. Adaptive reuse with medical expansion is within the program parameters. They want to be on record as supporting it. That's good news." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "The board chair called me this morning to apologize for the way the last few months went. He said he should have commissioned the adaptive reuse assessment 6 months ago instead of fighting the designation." A pause. "He also said that my grandfather would have been frustrated with him, which I thought was accurate." Wren looked at the window. The afternoon light came through it obliquely. Nothing like the morning, but still good. Still. The light of a room that had been placed deliberately with attention by someone who thought about where light needed to land. "I'm going to take on Eleanor's institute directorship," she said. "Her board approached me last week. I'll run it remotely for a year while the Hartley project gets established and then reassess." I was very still. "And I've spoken to the Historic District Commission about a consulting role. Savannah has a significant amount of work that needs doing." She looked at him. "I'll keep the Philadelphia apartment for another 6 months and see how the logistics work." He looked at her. His face had the quality she knew now, the careful stillness that in him was not distance but its opposite, the stillness of someone who was letting something matter. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying." He looked at the cross, then back at her. He was standing close. The room was small. It was always close, and the afternoon light was doing the oblique version of what the morning light did not perfect, but present the window earning its placement even at the wrong hour. "Okay, Tutton," he said, in the way he said things that were not small. She looked at him. He reached out, and his hand found hers. Not a gesture, not a performance, just a hand finding another hand in a small room where both of them had decided to be. She didn't look away. Outside, the assessment team was measuring the adjacent parcel. In the adjacent parcel would eventually be built a trauma center with 12 bays and advanced imaging and a surgical suite that would mean people from across the river didn't have to be diverted to Augusta. In the east wing of Hartley Hospital, properly conserved the chapel would be documented and interpreted and open to the public, and would carry forward what it had always carried, the evidence that someone had thought about it specifically, had decided a room deserved a morning window, and had built accordingly. Both things. At the same time. The only resolution that honored the full complexity of what was real. She held his hand in the small room in the afternoon light, and felt for the first time in a month that everything was in its right place. The weeks that followed had a different texture than any of the preceding ones. The pressure that had structured everything since her first morning in Savannah, the 6-week deadline, the documentation race. The council vote was gone, replaced by the long middle-distance work of a project that had been decided in principle and now needed to be built in practice. Different stakes. The same level of care required, but distributed differently over a longer horizon. Wren moved out of the bed and breakfast and into a furnished apartment on Taylor Street that Dottie had found for her, as if Dottie had been waiting for the need to arise. The apartment was on the second floor of a converted 1880s townhouse, with tall ceilings and plaster walls and windows that faced a garden she didn't own but could see from her desk. She set up her workstation beside the window that got the afternoon light and called it sufficient. She and Callum moved into each other's lives, the way people move into buildings they've already learned, not the first-time uncertainty of unfamiliar space, but the navigation of something already mapped. They knew each other's rhythms from weeks of early morning meetings. He was up before 6. He thought better when moving. He was more comfortable with direct conversation than with approach. She worked late and forgot to eat and had opinions about windows and made decisions faster than he expected, and slower than she appeared to. They had the first real fight 3 weeks in about a planning meeting she'd missed because she'd been at the archives and hadn't looked at her phone. It was not a large fight in terms of topic, and it was a significant one in terms of what it clarified that they both had a tendency to operate inside their own focus without announcing it, and that this was fine when they were each on separate projects and actively limiting contact when they were attempting to be part of each other's lives. They figured it out in about 40 minutes in the kitchen of his apartment, both of them standing at the counter, because neither had thought to sit down, and the figure out involved being direct and specific and not making it larger than it was. After she said, "You're not bad at this," he said, "At what?" "Disagreements. You don't perform or withdraw. You just talk." He looked slightly puzzled. "What else would you do?" She thought about the 4 years she hadn't talked to her father. "A lot of things," she said. Her father came to Savannah in July. He drove down from Philadelphia alone, arriving on a Thursday afternoon, and Wren met him at the building. It was the first time he had been back since 1986. He walked through the gap in the fence. The fence was scheduled to come down next month when the construction assessment was complete, and into the main corridor, and he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides looking at the terrazzo floor. "It's better than I remembered," he said. "The stabilization helped. The bones are still good." He walked slowly down the corridor, looking at the walls the way a contractor looked at walls, not aesthetically but structurally, reading the material. "The plasters had water. The brick under it is fine. We know." The structural report was thorough. He walked to the east staircase and up, and she followed him, and he found the second-floor corridor without direction and stopped in front of the open chapel door. He stood in the doorway for a long time. She stayed back, giving him the space of it. After a while, he went in. She heard him cross the floor, the particular sound of heart pine under a person's weight. Then silence. She counted to 60 and then went in. I was standing in front of the cross, his hands in his pockets. He was 68 years old, and he looked it in this light, not old, but fully aged the years present in him without apology. "Robert Anderson told me this would be sealed," he said. He said it like he was ashamed of it, like sealing it was the only option they had, and he knew it wasn't right. A pause. "I said I was sorry." He said it wasn't mine to be sorry for. Wren looked at the cross. "You're the one who made sure it wasn't sealed forever," she said. He turned to look at her. "I didn't do anything. I did masonry work for 5 days and went home. You stood in here for 10 minutes and thought about the person who put the window where the window needed to be." She looked at him. "And 40 years later you told me about it when I asked." She paused. "That's how things survive. Someone holds them and then gives them to the next person." I was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window in its oblique way. "I should have called you," he said. "The 4 years. I thought about it often, and I didn't do it." "I know. I didn't call either. You called first. Eleanor told me to." He almost smiled. "I'd like to have met her. She would have liked you. She respected people who knew how materials behaved." She paused. "She had opinions. So do you. I come by it honestly." He almost smiled again, more completely this time. And she saw herself in it, the same shape of a smile, the same slight reluctance to let it be large. They had the same quality. She hadn't understood that when she was younger, and she understood it now. That evening she introduced him to Callum at the restaurant on MLK Boulevard, and the two of them talked about construction and materials and structural assessment for 90 minutes without running out of things to say. She sat between them and ate her food and felt the particular warmth of a good evening, not dramatic, not complete, in the way that stories were complete, just a good evening in a good restaurant in Savannah, with two people who had both showed up when showing up was required. Her father drove home on Friday. At his car he said, "The building's going to be fine." "I think so too." "And you're going to be fine." She looked at him. "Yes." He nodded. He was not a man who said more than was needed. He got in his car and drove away, and she stood on the sidewalk and watched until the car turned the corner and then walked back to her apartment in the Savannah afternoon, the live oaks doing what they always did, the city absorbing everything unchanged. Priya Seth came to the building in August. Wren had not expected this, and Callum had not arranged it. Priya had arranged it herself, calling Wren directly and asking if she could do a walkthrough, not as a hospital representative, but personally. They met at the fence on a Saturday morning. Priya was shorter than Wren had imagined from Callum's descriptions, with the particular physical precision of a surgeon, economical in her movements, very direct in her eyes. She had been vocally opposed to the preservation campaign and had told Callum to his face that his adaptive reuse report had weakened their position, and she clearly intended to be straightforward about that with Wren as well. "I was wrong," she said at the start of the walkthrough, unprompted. Wren looked at her. About the adaptive reuse? About the building. I thought it was a sentimentality argument. I thought people who preserved buildings were prioritizing aesthetics over function. She was walking beside Wren down the main corridor, looking at the walls with clear eyes. I think I confuse sentimentality with evidence. A lot of people do. The chapel documentation. She stopped. When I read the foreman's letter, the sentence about the families asking for nothing more than a place to bring their grief and their gratitude, I had to read it several times. She looked at the chandelier frame. That's not sentimentality. That's evidence of what a place was used for and why it mattered. Yes, Callum was right to write the report. How was? I told him that, Priya said. He said thank you in a way that was infuriating because he clearly already knew. She said it with a slight amusement that suggested she found Callum's equanimity more endearing than she was willing to directly admit. In the chapel, Priya stood in front of the cross for a while without speaking. Then she said the trauma center is going to be built. I know. People will not die on the road to Augusta because there wasn't capacity. She said it quietly, not as a victory, but as a fact. And this room will be here. Yes. Both things. Yes. She turned to look at Wren. Thank you for not letting it be only one thing. Wren held that. It was the most direct acknowledgement she'd received from anyone on the hospital side, and she could see that it was not easily given by a person who was used to being the person giving the hardest news. The building made the argument, Wren said. I just made sure the argument was heard. Priya nodded. Then she looked around the chapel one more time and walked out, and Wren stood in the room alone for a moment, with the morning light coming in at its best angle, the specific quality of a Savannah morning in late August. The heat already building, but the light still clear, and felt for the second time since this had all begun that everything was in its right place. She called Eleanor's number by accident that evening. Old habit. The number had been reassigned to someone who said, hello, with the particular confusion of someone who had been called by a stranger, and Wren apologized and hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a minute. Then she went to her desk and opened her laptop and began working on the Phase 2 documentation, the Adaptive Reuse Interpretation Plan, the Chapel Preservation Protocol, the Oral History Archive that would house the testimonies of Gertrude Cole, Isaiah Parks, and Vera Washington, and worked until midnight and ate what was in the refrigerator and went to bed and did not dream about anything she could remember. The building stood in the dark on the empty street. The adjacent parcel had survey stakes in it now, bright orange flags marking the corners of what would eventually be a trauma wing. In the east, past the live oaks and the squares and the river. The Georgia coast was dark, and the Atlantic was darker. Everything was in its right place, or close enough to keep going. The Adaptive Reuse Assessment Report came back in September, 6 weeks after the board commissioned it. Wren read it at her desk on Taylor Street with her second coffee making notes in the margins, professional habit. While outside her window, the Savannah garden did what September gardens in Georgia did, which was to be lush and slightly past its best and entirely itself. The report confirmed what Callum had estimated in his original document. The hybrid approach preserving the east wing and the chapel, while building the trauma expansion on the adjacent parcel, was viable. The cost premium over full demolition was approximately $6 million. The timeline premium was 11 months. Both numbers were material and real, and both were also survivable if the grant extension came through, and the board committed to a supplementary fundraising campaign. The grant extension was already in progress. The board had authorized the fundraising campaign on the same day they commissioned the assessment, which suggested the decision had already been made before the assessment was requested. The assessment was cover not deliberation, which was fine. The outcome was the same. She sent her notes to Louise and called Callum. I read the report, she said. What do you think? The cost estimate is conservative in a way that will work in your favor. They've included contingency buffers that will likely not be fully used. The timeline estimate is probably accurate. She paused. The structural integration approach on page 47 is elegant. Whoever wrote that section understood both the historic material and the modern construction requirements. That section was added at my request. He was quiet for a moment. I had a conversation with the lead architect about the chapel specifically, about why the east wing couldn't simply be facaded, preserved on the exterior, but gutted inside. What did you tell him? I told him the room was a material witness, and that the interior had to be intact or there was nothing left to witness to. A pause. He asked me what a material witness was, and I explained it. He said that was a useful concept and he'd use it going forward. Good, he should. She looked at her notes. The board meets Thursday. Thursday at 4. I'm presenting the assessment findings. What's the expected vote? Unanimous approval. He said it with the equanimity of someone who had done the difficult work of moving an institution and was now watching the institution arrive at the position he'd been holding for months. They want to be on record as supporting both the preservation and the medical mission. The landmark designation made that possible. The landmark designation made it necessary, Wren said. Possible was always there. Yes. A slight pause. That's a distinction I'll make in my presentation. She looked out the window. I'll be there Thursday. I know. She hung up and went back to her notes. And the September morning continued, and the grant extension paperwork was processing in an office in Atlanta, and the city of Savannah was absorbing another day in the way it absorbed all days without urgency, without waste, with the patient continuity of a place that had been doing this for a very long time. In October, the fundraising campaign launched publicly. The coalition co-led it with the hospital. Louise and the hospital board's new chair presenting together at a press event that Wren attended and did not speak at. Because it was not the moment for the preservation architect to speak. It was the moment for the community-facing story to be told, and Louise told it with the precision of someone who had been waiting 15 years for the right version of this press conference. The campaign raised its supplementary target in 11 days. Wren learned about it from a text from Marcus at 9:30 in the morning. 11 days. We're fully funded. And then a minute later, a second text. Eleanor would have had something dry to say about this. She sat with her phone in her hand and thought about what Eleanor would have said. Probably something about how it was easier to raise money for something that already existed than for something that needed to be built, and how this was a design flaw in the architecture of philanthropy, and how one should nonetheless be grateful for the 11 days and get back to work. She sent Marcus, "Get back to work." He responded with a thumbs up. She got back to work. The cotton warehouse project was in full documentation phase. She and 2 colleagues had been in the building 3 days a week for the past month cataloging everything. It was a different building than Hartley Industrial rather than institutional. Its history, a commercial history rather than a medical one, its significance in the record of Savannah's economic development rather than its social one. But the methodology was the same. You put your hand on the wall and you listened. She had found something in the cotton warehouse that she had not expected to find evidence of: a worker's reading room, a small space on the second floor near the riverside that the historical record did not mention. The cotton gin workers, many of them formerly enslaved in the years just after the Civil War, had used it to hold literacy classes. There was documentary evidence in a church archive that Marcus had found on a Thursday afternoon, a letter from a Baptist minister to his congregation, noting that the cotton warehouse classes had produced 12 readers in their first year of operation. The room still existed. The shelving was gone. The function was invisible unless you knew to look, but the room was there and the window faced north toward the river and the light that came through it. In the afternoon was the particular light of a room that had been used for something that mattered. Wren stood in it for 10 minutes the first time she found it, and thought about W.T. Arden, who had noted that the chapel window faced the right direction for the morning. Someone had always thought about where light needed to land. You just had to look. The Hartley Hospital Adaptive Reuse Project broke ground in November, on a morning when the Savannah air had finally conceded to something approaching coolness. The live oaks holding still. For once the sky a pale clear blue that would have been unremarkable in Philadelphia and was extraordinary here. Wren stood at the construction fence, new chain link proper, with a sign, and watched a groundbreaking that was not in truth a dramatic moment. No official ceremony. The hospital board had suggested one and Callum had suggested against it on the grounds that the argument had already been made and there was nothing left to perform, and he had won that particular disagreement with unusual ease. So it was just the project management team and the lead contractor and a few hospital staff, and Louise and Marcus from the coalition, and Wren standing in the November morning watching a piece of equipment take the first cut of the adjacent parcel. Louise stood beside her. 4-3, she said. 4-3, Wren said. They watched the machine work. Across the fence through the building's original windows, cleaned now properly. The grime gone. The terrazzo floor was visible in the morning light, the Minton pattern catching the low-angle November sun in a way that made it look almost animated. Callum came up on her other side, slightly late still, in his white coat. He'd been in the hospital since 5. How was the OR? She asked. Busy. He looked at the machine. But everyone made it. She leaned into him slightly, the small weight of it, and he absorbed it without comment because that was how they were. Now the small adjustments, the easy presence, nothing announced. Louise said she had to make calls and left them there. They stood at the fence for 20 minutes watching the preliminary earthwork. My grandfather would have had thoughts about the equipment choices, Callum said. Was he opinionated about constructions? About everything, particularly about the doing of things right. He watched the machine maneuver. He would have walked every inch of the site before the first cut. Did you? Yesterday afternoon. A pause. The existing utility runs are better placed than the initial assessment suggested. It'll save about 3 weeks on the infrastructure phase. He said it in the voice he used when he had done something careful and was not quite announcing it. I sent the report to the contractor this morning. She looked at him. You've been doing site prep. I've been reading the geotechnical reports and the utility maps and making some suggestions. Callum, that's not your job. My grandfather spent 22 years ensuring this institution ran correctly. This is the closest I can come to continuing that. He turned to look at her. Someone has to care about the details. She held that. The man who had fought for 2 years to demolish this building was now reading geotechnical reports on the adjacent lot to save 3 weeks on the infrastructure phase. She could have said something about that, the irony, the completeness of the turn. She didn't because he already knew it and didn't need her to narrate it. Vera Washington is coming to the site, Blessing, she said instead. Her daughter's driving her up from Savannah. Good. He looked at the building. I want to meet her. She'll want to meet you. I told her about your grandfather. I was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? That he was a man who worked in this building for 22 years and knew what was in the walls and kept it safe until the right moment. She paused. She said that was a kind of devotion. I was very still. She's right. I know. The machine took another pass at the earth. The building stood steady, unchanged, holding what it had always held. The site blessing was held in the chapel. This had been Wren's idea, and she'd proposed it to the hospital board with the directness that she'd learned was the only effective mode with the board now that the adversarial period was over. They'd agreed without much deliberation. The Landmarks Review Board provided a formal statement for the occasion. The Civil Rights Historical Commission sent a representative. 12 people stood in the 14 by 18 room on a cold December morning. Vera Washington sat in a folding chair that Marcus had brought, her hands folded, her eyes moving slowly around the space, the cross, the window, the floor, the ceiling in the way of someone seeing something they had been told about for a long time and finding it exactly as described. There was no ceremony precisely. The coalition's board chair said a few words about what the building had held and what it would continue to hold. The hospital's new CEO, a woman who had been appointed in October and who had made the adaptive reuse project her first institutional priority, said a few words about what the trauma center would mean for the community across the river. Wren said nothing because she had said what needed to be said in the application in the council chamber, and she didn't need to say it again. Callum stood near the door. He had come from a shift. He was very quiet. At the end, Vera Washington asked if she could say something. She stood slowly with her daughter's hand briefly at her elbow, and then she stood on her own in the room, and she looked at the cross on the wall for a moment before she spoke. My mother told me about this room every few years until she died, she said. She said it was the room they gave us, and she said we should use it right. She never said she was grateful for the room, because the room was small, and the reason for it was not something to be grateful for. But she said the window was a gift. She said someone had thought about the morning, and she had always wanted to say thank you for that. She looked at the window. So, thank you. No one said anything for a moment. Then Wren found Callum's hand in the crowd without looking, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stood in the room that W.T. Arden had built in the summer of 1889, and that Herschel Groves had added to a set of documents that were not the official documents, and that had waited in a wall for 63 years for someone to come and find it. And outside the Savannah December was doing what Savannah did, absorbing the present without losing any of the past, and the morning window was doing exactly what it had always been intended to do. The Trauma Center opened in March, 18 months later. The Hartley Trauma Center at Savannah Regional Medical Center. 16 bays advanced imaging. 2 surgical suites, a rooftop helipad that had required a variance but gotten it. On the wall of the main entrance, a panel, a brief history of the Hartley Hospital site with photographs of the 1889 construction. The surgical wing at its operational peak. The 1986 restoration. The sealed chapel. The site blessing. At the end of the panel, a reproduction of a sentence from W.T. Arden's Field Notes. It is a fine room. The window faces the right direction for the morning. The east wing of the original building had been converted into the Hartley Memorial Health and Heritage Center, a community history space, the chapel at its center, open to the public 5 days a week. Vera Washington attended the opening. Gertrude Cole sent a letter which Marcus read aloud. Isaiah Parks came in person at 86 years old and walked into the chapel and stood in front of the cross for a long time before he turned around and said simply, "Yes, that's right." Callum performed the first surgery in the new center on opening day. A trauma case. As it happened, a young man brought in by ambulance from the south side who was in stable condition within the hour, and who would not know for a long time, if ever, what had gone into the building he'd been brought to. Wren stood in the chapel that afternoon after the opening events, after the crowd had gone. The room was hers for a moment, empty and itself. The afternoon light was wrong. As always, it would always be wrong in the afternoon. The window faced east. Northeast, you could not change the physics of light, but it was still good. Still the light of a room placed deliberately with attention. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Callum leaned in the doorway, still in surgical attire, a cup of coffee in each hand. He looked at her. "You're in here again," he said. "I come here to think." "I know. I always know where to find you." He came in and handed her one of the cups. They stood side by side in front of the window, the way they had stood many times in this room, and looked at the afternoon light doing its wrong-angle version of what it was made to do. "How was the surgery?" she asked. "Good." He held his coffee cup. "He's going to be fine." "Good." They were quiet for a moment, comfortable in it. The particular ease of two people who had spent enough time together that silence no longer required management. "Priya wants to know if we're coming to the department dinner on Friday," he said. "Yes. She also wants to know if you've decided about the Institute grant." "I submitted the application last week." Wren sipped her coffee. "Eleanor's Institute is getting the Georgia expansion funding. I'll be running both offices." He looked at her. "When did you decide?" "Officially last week, actually around the time I came back from Philadelphia." She met his eyes. "I just needed to get the logistical pieces in place before I said it out loud." "You could have told me." "You knew." I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I knew." Outside the window. Savannah was going about its afternoon, the squares full of tourists and locals, the river with its container ships, the live oaks in their permanent state of motion and stillness. The city continuous and layered and going about the long business of being itself, in the way that places with deep memory went about being themselves. In the morning, the light would come through this window, at the angle it had always come falling across the heart pine floor, in the precise path that Herschel Groves had intended in 1889, when he had added this room to a set of documents that were not the official documents, because he had thought about where light needed to land and had built accordingly. The room had been sealed for 63 years, and it had held everything it had been given. The cross was still on the wall. The floor was still the original material. The window still faced the right direction. Some things were worth keeping, not out of sentiment, out of evidence, out of the argument that what had been made by human hands at a particular moment in history, for particular reasons, carried information that could not be recreated once it was gone. And some things, when they were lost, stayed lost. And some things, through the particular chain of people who held them and passed them forward through field notes and architects' letters, and a contractor's 10-minute stand in an empty room and a surgeon's 3-year vigil at a fence, came back. Wren held her coffee and looked at the window and thought about the dead having something left to say, and about what it meant to be the person who made sure it got said, and about a woman in a West Philadelphia meeting house who had spent her life arguing that both of those things were the most important argument there was. She thought Eleanor was right. She almost always was. "Let's go home," Callum said. She looked at him. His face in the afternoon light, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular quality of his attention, the complex expression that was not complex at all once you knew how to read it. A person who had stopped letting the difficulty of a thing be a reason not to do it. She had been that kind of person since Eleanor taught her to be. She had just needed to find the other kind. "Let's go home," she said. They left the cup on the windowsill and walked out together through the corridor, down the east staircase, through the main entrance of the building that had held everything it had been given and was still holding, still standing still in its right place in the city that had always known what it was. The door behind them swung gently on its original hinges, opened the morning already on its way. 3 years later, The Hartley Memorial Chapel received the Georgia Historic Preservation Award for Community Significance. Vera Washington attended the ceremony. Callum accepted on behalf of the hospital. Wren was in Athens, Greece for a week-long symposium on adaptive reuse and called from her hotel at midnight, Savannah time, to ask how it went. It went well, Callum said. What did you say? I said my grandfather worked in this building for 22 years. I said he knew what was in the walls. I said someone before him had put a window in a room where it needed to be, and that was the whole argument. A pause. Vera Washington cried. She always cries at the right things. Yes. Another pause. Come home. Saturday, she said. I'll be home Saturday. The window in the chapel faced east, northeast, and in the morning the light came through it exactly as intended, falling across the heart pine floor at the angle that Herschel Groves had calculated in 1889 because he had thought about where light needed to land. It still did. It always would. 6 months after that, Wren's father drove down to Savannah for Thanksgiving. He stayed 4 days. On the second morning, he and Callum walked the construction site of a new project, a 19th-century cotton warehouse on the Savannah River that Wren's firm had just taken on for adaptive reuse as a mixed-use cultural center. Wren watched them from inside through the original warehouse windows while she worked on the documentation package. They walked the perimeter twice. Her father crouched to examine the original brick at the base of the east wall, and Callum crouched beside him, and she watched two men looking at a wall together with the shared attention of people who understood what walls were made of and what they were for. When they came back inside, her father said, "The lintel above the river entrance is sagging. It needs sistering before you touch anything else." "It's in the structural report," Wren said. "I know. I read the report." He looked at Callum. "She sent it to me." Callum looked at her. She looked at the window. "He has opinions about masonry," she said. "Good," Callum said. "So does she." Her father sat down at the table with his coffee and looked at the documentation spread across it, the original building plans, the historical photographs, the materials assessment. He looked at it the way he had always looked at work, as a thing to be understood, a set of problems to be solved correctly, a material argument about what was possible and what was required. "You do this well," he said. Not to Wren particularly. To the room, maybe. To the fact of the work itself. "We try," Wren said. Outside, the Savannah River moved past in the November light, the container ships going by in their slow, continuous way, the city on both banks absorbing the present without losing any of the past. The warehouse held them old brick and good bones, another building with something left to say. Wren put her hand flat on the interior wall, the original plaster cold, the lath beneath it, the brick beneath that, and listened. Something was there. There was always something there. She went back to work. The last time Wren went into the Hartley Chapel alone was in April 4 years after the vote. She was in the Heritage Center for a site visit. The interpretive panels had been updated to include new oral history material. A recorded interview with Isaiah Parks conducted 3 months before he died at 87. And after the staff meeting, she went down the corridor and into the room and stood there for a while. The morning light was perfect. She had arrived at 8:30 specifically because she wanted to see it. The cross was on the wall. The heart pine floor was exactly as it had been in 1889, except for a small section near the window that had been replaced with matching material. After the roof work, you could tell only if you knew where to look, and she knew where to look, and it looked right. Someone had done the replacement correctly. She put her hand on the south wall beside the cross. Cold plaster, dry lath beneath, brick beneath that. The building held everything it had been given. It had always held everything it had been given. All it had needed was the right person to come and open the door. She thought about Eleanor, who had sent her here knowing she was the right person and had trusted her to figure out the rest. She thought about Herschel Groves, who had put a window where it needed to be in a room that was not supposed to exist because he had thought about where light needed to land. She thought about W.T. Arden, who had written it down in a ledger because someone had told him to document it there, not elsewhere, and who had done exactly as he was told, and in doing so had made it findable. She thought about her father crouching at the east wall of a cotton warehouse with Callum beside him, looking at a brick that needed to be looked at. She thought about the particular quality of attention that preservation required. Not nostalgia, not sentiment, but the genuine discipline of looking at something made by human hands and asking what it was trying to say, and then making sure that it got heard. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Eleanor had known that before she did. She stood in the morning light for another 5 minutes. Then she walked out through the corridor, down the staircase, through the main entrance, out into the Savannah spring, the azaleas going, the live oaks in full extravagant green, the city continuous and unhurried, absorbing everything, and got in her car and drove to the cotton warehouse where her father's structural note was now incorporated into the renovation plan and where the work of the next 2 years was waiting. Behind her, the building stood in the morning. The window was doing what it always did. Somewhere in the east, past the river, past the coast, the Atlantic was exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything in its right place. The dead had something left to say, and it had gotten said. In January, 8 months after the groundbreaking, Wren flew to Philadelphia for the Eleanor Parish Institute board meeting. She had been running the combined Institute Philadelphia and Savannah offices for 4 months, and the board meeting was the first formal review of the expanded operation. She had prepared thoroughly, which was her default mode, and she sat at the head of the conference table in the Philadelphia office, the same office where she had worked for 6 years before Savannah, and presented the first-year plan with the precision of someone who understood both the work and the people in the room. The board approved the plan unanimously, after in Eleanor's old office. Still, Eleanor's office, the board had not changed it yet, and Wren was not sure she would ever change it. She sat in Eleanor's chair and looked at Eleanor's bookshelves, still full of Eleanor's books, and thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not the ownership of it, the responsibility for it. She thought about Callum's grandfather, who had worked in Hartley for 22 years and had known what was in the walls. She thought about Eleanor, who had spent 50 years knowing what was in buildings, and making sure people understood the difference between what they contained and what could be recreated. She thought about W.T. Arden and Herschel Groves, who were 130 years dead and were still in a specific and literal sense communicating something important. She thought about what it meant to do the work right. She looked at Eleanor's desk. In the corner, a small framed photograph she had not looked at closely before Eleanor at what appeared to be a preservation site in the American Southwest desert rock formations in the background. Eleanor in her 60s and squinting into the sun with the expression of someone who had just identified something interesting in a wall. Eleanor had never been purely sentimental about anything. She had been precise. She had cared about buildings because buildings were evidence and evidence mattered, and the loss of evidence was the loss of argument, and the loss of argument was the loss of the ability to claim that certain things had happened and had mattered. The dead have something left to say. Wren was going to keep saying it. That was the whole job. That was what Eleanor had passed to her, and what she would pass forward in whatever form it needed to take. She flew back to Savannah the next morning. Callum was at the airport, which she had not asked for, and he had not announced. She came through the arrivals door with her bag, and found him standing with his hands in his pockets looking at the arrivals board. And when he turned and saw her, his face did what it had started doing in the past few months. The complex expression simplifying the controlled quality opening into something more direct. "You didn't need to come," she said. "I know." He took her bag. "I wanted to." They drove back to the city in the January morning light. The Savannah light, even in January, carrying more warmth than Philadelphia. Like the live oaks in their winter version, still substantial, the city going about its business. "How was the board meeting?" he asked. "Good. They approved the expansion plan." And Eleanor's office. She looked out the window. "I'm going to leave it as it is for another year. Then I'll think about what it should be." He nodded. "That seems right." "How was the week?" "Busy." A slight pause. "We had a case Thursday, a woman brought in from across the river, significant trauma, internal bleeding. The kind of case we would have had to divert 18 months ago." He looked at the road. "She made it. 3 days in the ICU, and she made it." Wren looked at him. He was looking at the road with the specific quality of concentration that he used when he was also looking at something else. "Your grandfather," she said. "He would have said it was a good week." He paused. He would have been right. They drove through the Savannah squares. Each one a different kind of stillness. Forsyth with its fountain, Madison with its church, the smaller ones whose names she'd finally learned and could now navigate by without thinking. The live oaks absorbed the January light. The city went about being itself. She put her hand on his on the gear shift. He turned his hand over so their palms were together. They drove the rest of the way without talking through the city that had been continuously inhabited since 1733 and that had held everything. It had been given the grief and the history and the argument and the evidence and the 10-minute stand in a small room with a morning window without forgetting any of it. The building was still there. The window still faced east-northeast. In the morning, the light would come through it at the angle it had always come falling across the heart pine floor in the precise path that Herschel Groves had intended, because he had thought about where light needed to land. It always would. Everything continuing, everything in its right place, or close enough to keep going.